The Apples of Life, from Young Folks' Library of Choice Literature, Legends of Norseland, edited by Mara L. Pratt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Apples of Life, Part 1. Among the gods in Asgard dwelt the beautiful Idun, the goddess whose care it was to guard the apples of life. Idun, Odin had said as he gave into her hands the rosy apples, to guard these apples and keep them forever from all harm is to do a greater service for Asgard than even Thor with his mighty thunders, or Baldur with his warm light can do. For these are the apples of everlasting youth. Without them, what would Asgard be more than the cities of Midgard or Jotunheim? What would the gods be more than the mortals of Midgard or the giants of Jotunheim? So guard them well, beautiful Idun, for to them you owe your beauty, even as we owe to them our never-fading youth. One day, when all was quiet and peaceful and happy in the city of Asgard, Loki, feeling within him the stirring of his own evil heart, betook himself to Midgard in search of mischief. The peace and quiet of Asgard he could no longer endure. Then too it was to him a cruel delight to shoot his arrows into the lives of the helpless children of Midgard and make them sad. Oh, Loki was a cruel god. Surely, Odin would sometimes say, as he looked upon him and thought of the wretchedness that yet would befall on Asgard through Loki's wicked deeds. Surely Loki was the spirit of a frost giant, and the frost giants are bitter, bitter foes of Asgard. This day, Loki longed for mischief. I will go down to Midgard and find some happy heart to sadden, said he, his eyes shining with their wicked delight. Down the rainbow bridge he hastened, and, with a light bound, sprang upon a bright tree in the beautiful land of Midgard. Who are you? He cried, seeing in the tree beside him a great white bird. But the bird made no reply. He only winked and blinked and stared at Loki, and crooned and pruned his feathers. Do you not know a god speaks to you? Stormed Loki, growing angry even with a bird. Still, no answer. Was there ever such a stupid bird? Indeed, like the people of Midgard, you seem to have no wisdom, sneered Loki. And determined to vent his evil mood, he seized a branch and began to beat the bird. Then a strange thing happened. The bird, who all this time had seemed so stupid, too stupid even to fly away, now seized upon the bough and held it fast. Loki pulled and pulled with all his godlike strength. He could not move it. It was as if held in the grasp of a giant. Stupid bird, sneered Loki when he found he could do the bird no harm. I will not stay in the tree with such a stupid creature. A strange sound, almost like a laugh of triumph, squeezed itself out from the beak of the big bird. Go, Loki, go at once. Go back to Asgard, or perhaps you would like to go with me to Jotunheim, spoke the bird at last. And as he spoke, he spread his wings and arose high in the air. Alas, alas for Loki! As the bird rose, he rose too, nor could he free himself. He screamed, he fought, he begged, he strove with all his godlike arts to free himself, but all in vain. On they flew, the bird and Loki, across the sky, over and under and between the clouds, across the great wide sea, at last across the snow-white peaks, down to a castle in Jotunheim, in the land of the mighty frost giants, the terrible, the dreaded enemies of the gods. Let me free! Let me free! Foamed Loki, struggling against the bird, whose magic held him fast. I will never let you free, answered the bird, throwing off his disguise and standing forth a giant foe. I will never let you free, except on one condition. I grant it, "Whatever it is, I grant it," cried the coward, caring for nothing but to free himself. "The condition is this," continued the giant coolly. "I will let you free if you will bring me, without delay, the apples of everlasting youth, the apples that Idun guards and watches over, locked so closely in the golden casket in the city of Asgard." Loki stared. He caught his breath. To give up the apples of life, the fruit by which the gods were kept forever young and strong and beautiful. That was too great a thing to ask, even of Loki, evil as he was. "There are no such apples," answered he, trying, as cowards always do, to hide himself behind a lie. "There are no such apples." "Very well," answered the giant, opening a great dungeon door and thrusting Loki in. "When you are ready to do what I say, you may come out. Never until then." The great dungeon door creaked upon its terrible hinges, and Loki was alone, a prisoner at the mercy of the frost giant. Loki howled and beat against the walls of the dungeon. "Are you ready to do what I asked of you?" asked the frost giant, opening the great door the next morning. "There are no such apples," cried Loki. "On my honor as a god, I swear it." The giant made no reply. The heavy door creaked again, and Loki was alone. "Are you ready to do what I asked of you?" asked the frost giant, opening the great door the second morning. "Anything in all Asgard, O giant, I promise you. Anything but the apples," cried Loki. The giant made no reply. The heavy door creaked again, and Loki was alone. "Are you willing to do what I asked of you?" said the frost giant, opening the great door the third morning. "One of the apples, O giant, I might steal from Idun and escape with before the fruit was missed," Loki began. The giant made no reply. The heavy door creaked again, and Loki was alone. "Are you ready to do what I asked of you?" asked the frost giant, opening the great door the fourth morning. "Yes, 2 of the 3 apples will I promise to bring you. With even one left, the gods might be content, for even then their lives would be far longer than the life of mortals." The giant made no reply. The heavy door creaked again, and Loki was alone. "Are you ready to do what I asked of you?" asked the frost giant, opening the great door the 5th morning. "Yes," answered Loki meekly. "Are you willing to bring the apples of life?" "Yes." "And you will bring all 3 of them?" "Yes." "And you will bring them at once?" "Yes." "Go then. I will go with you. Outside the walls of the shining city, I will wait for you to bring the apples to me." Then, putting on the guise of birds, the 2 set forth, reaching the gateway of the city just as the sun god was pouring down his flood of red and golden light upon the shining spires. The whole city lay bathed in the sunset splendor. "Idun," said Loki, going directly to her, "it is well you guard so closely these golden apples of life. Without them we should grow old and die, even as wretched mortals grow old and die. Indeed, it would fare ill with us if harm came to these precious apples," answered Idun. "See the rich bloom upon them. If that were lost, then would our bloom be lost as well. We should grow old and wrinkled." "Yes," answered Loki, "and still it seems very strange. But outside the gate of our city, just on the outer walls, are growing apples. Looking so like these, I cannot tell them one from the other. Bring your apples with you, and let us see if they are alike. If they should prove to be, I will gather them for you, and we will put them all together in the golden casket." "How strange," thought Idun innocently. The frost giant, in his great bird guise, wheeled round and round, impatiently awaiting the coming of Idun and the apples. Hardly had the gates closed upon her, when down he swooped, seized her in his great strong beak, and flew with her across the sea to his home among the mountains. The days rolled on and on. The sun god rose and drove his chariot across the sky and sank behind the distant purple hills 1,000 times. There was a gloom, a shadow over Asgard, for the gods were growing old. The life gone out of their eyes, their smooth round faces grown thin and peaked, their step was halting, and the feebleness of age was falling upon them. "It is Loki who has done this. It is Loki who has done this," thundered Thor one day, when from old age and weakness he had been defeated in battle with the now ever youthful giants. "It is Loki who has done this, and we will bear it no longer. Look at Odin, even he grows weak and bent and trembling. He is like the old men in Midgard, he, Odin the All-Father." Thor's indignation waxed stronger and stronger. He set forth in search of Loki. "I will not even wait for him to come," he thundered, seizing his hammer and setting forth. "I shall find him, the evil-hearted, somewhere making mischief among the innocent people of Midgard," said he. "Henceforth, O evil-hearted, cruel Loki," burst forth the angry Thor, "henceforth Thor guards the walls of Asgard. Midgard, the skies, he shall forsake. No more will he brew storms, never shall the thunder roll nor the lightnings flash, for Thor will watch forever upon the battlements of Asgard the approach of the evil god who has brought such grief upon us. Never shall he enter the gates of the city again. Let him dare approach even to the golden gates, and Thor will smite him with his mighty hammer." Loki quailed before the fury of the great god Thor. To be an outcast from Asgard, even he could not bear. "Spare me, spare me," whined the cowardly Loki. "Spare me once more, and I will go again to Jotunheim. I will bring back Idun and the 3 apples of life." Thor stood looking at the cowardly Loki. He longed to strike him with the hammer, to kill him with his thunderbolt, to scorch him with his lightning arrows. But evil as he was, Loki was immortal. He was the son of Odin. "Go then, you mischief-making, evil-hearted son of unhappy Odin. Go, and whether success is yours or not, remember Thor guards the walls of Asgard and watches with his thunders for your return. Never, never as long as Thor wields the mighty hammer and holds the powers of thunder and lightning, shall Loki enter the golden city without the golden apples of immortal life." Without another word, Loki put on his guise of a great white bird and sped across the sea and sky, again to the land of Jotunheim. Straight down he swooped upon the castle of the giant who all this time had kept Idun imprisoned in a strong walled tower of solid rock. The giant was out upon the sea, and "it is well for me," thought Loki, "that he is. No power in Midgard or in Asgard could wrest these precious apples from the giant's grasp." One quick look out over the mountains and down upon the sea, and Loki seized Idun in his talons, changed her at once into a nut, the apple safe within the shell, and swept away towards Asgard. But alas for Loki, the giant had heard the whir of the great white wings. Leaping to his feet in his boat, he scanned the sky with his sharp giant eye. "It is Loki! It is Loki!" bellowed he, catching sight of the great white bird among the clouds. "It is Loki! It is Loki! No bird of Midgard flies so high nor sweeps the air with such mighty wings." With one great giant pull, he shot his boat upon the shore. With one great giant bound, he struck the mountain top. "The apples of life! The apples of life!" he thundered. "Gone! Gone! The apples of life are gone!" 1 second, and putting on the guise of a great grey eagle, he shot up into the sky in swift pursuit of Loki. The sun god hid his chariot behind a cloud that the shadows might protect and cover Loki. Thor sent forth his thunder. The skies blackened. The wind beat back the great grey eagle. The lightning staggered and blinded him. Still on and on he flew, gaining in spite of all upon the track of Loki. Every eye in Asgard was strained. Every giant in Jotunheim stood breathless upon his mountain. The great round faces of the giants grew tense, the wrinkled aged faces of the gods grew pale. It was a terrible race. It was a race for life and health and everlasting youth. "Build fires upon the walls, heap up the brush, stand ready with the tapers," cried Odin, who foresaw the end. The brush was heaped, each god stands ready, his haggard face growing whiter and thinner with fright and dread and eagerness. Already the rush of Loki's wings are heard. The eagle follows close. Nearer and nearer they come. Closer and closer is the race. One moment more, 1 second. The frightened eyes of Loki can be seen. So near he is. Thor sends his blinding fire once more across the eagle's track. It reels. For an instant it falls back, and that 1 second, with one last mighty stroke, Loki clears the walls and falls, exhausted, breathless, almost dead upon the golden pavement of the city. "The fires! The fires! The fires!" cried Odin. An instant, and there rises from the walls great sheets of blaze. The brush crackles and snaps and sends up great tongues of fire. The eagle, angry, desperate, and blinded by the lightning, sweeps on straight towards them. Like a foolish moth he bears down upon the city into the very heart of the blaze. A sudden crackling, a cry of pain, a cloud of black smoke, and the great grey eagle falls, a helpless mass, upon the pavement beside the breathless Loki. The haggard faces flush with hope and joy. The apples are safe. Idun has come back. The apples again are theirs, and life and joy and eternal youth once more are with them. Now the goddess of music bursts forth again in song. The god of poetry pours forth his melody. A feast is spread, and the gods and goddesses once more eat of the wonderful apples of life. The color comes back into their faded cheeks. Light again flashes from their eyes. Youth and health and strength are theirs again. Peace reigns once more in Asgard. End of The Apples of Life, from Young Folks' Library of Choice Literature, Legends of Norseland, edited by Mara L. Pratt. Recording by Annie Mars.
Them and Other Persian Hero Tales. Rostam's Romance. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the wondrous love of a maiden dear, for a mighty warrior, the pride of his day, who loved and married and rode away. For this is the romance of Rostam. Behold, it is written that never in the garden of kings bloomed there a fairer flower than Tamine, only princess of the house of Samengan. Fresh and sweet as a nosegay of lilies and pinks, this beauteous pomegranate flower, with her laughing dark eyes, her blue-black curls, and her soft, velvety voice, was indeed a joy to behold, and many there were who loved her. But, alas, the princess was wilful as well as fair, and so, though she had many suitors from far and near, she was attracted by none of them. For lo, her eye was fixed, and her heart was set upon a bright, particular star, blazing away with more than heavenly splendor in far, far off Persia. So, when her father would have married her unto this or that great prince, half laughing, half earnest, she would say, "Nay, nay, my father, one man only will I marry, and that is Rostam, the hero whose mighty prowess is exceeded only by his grandeur of soul." Now as it happened, the king of Samengan was feudatory unto Afrasib, the deadly enemy of Iran. And though the two countries were now at peace, the probability that Rostam, the great Persian Peliva, would ever visit the small kingdom of Samengan, or even so much as hear of the beautiful Tartar princess, seemed most unlikely. Therefore, when Tamine thus spoke of Rostam, the king chided, saying unto her, "Foolish child, Verily, as well mightest thou cry for the moon, as to set thy heart upon so distant and so bright a star. For lo, the southern palm stretcheth forth not its arms unto the northern pine, neither doth the lion mate with the gazelle. Cast, therefore, O pearl of my heart, this hero from thy thoughts, since only grief and pain can it bring unto thee, for ever to dream of the unattainable. But this Tamine could not do, for Rostem had become a part of her life, both waking and dreaming, as you shall hear. For it happened that the princess had for her nurse a Persian woman, Fatima by name, who loved nothing so well as to talk of the great champion of her country, so that from childhood up had the Tartar maiden heard the wonder tales of her hero. Yea, the most beautiful part of every day unto her, as far back as she could remember, was the twilight hour, when, seated at her nurse's feet, her head pillowed in her soft lap, for hours she would sit spellbound, listening eagerly unto Fatima as she related the mighty deeds of Rostem. How, when only 8 years old, he slew the king's white elephant, of the capture of the magic fortress, of his wonderful march into Mazenderan, of Rakush, and of all his daring deeds as a warrior. And behold, Fatima had also other things to relate of her hero, tales illustrating his beautiful tenderness, loyalty, and greatness of soul. And as the princess grew older, these stories appealed more to her than the wonder tales or the deeds of prowess. But all was listened to with eagerness and delight by the infatuated Tamine, who, thus fed upon romance, grew into a tall, beautiful maiden, with never a thought for any man save Rostem the Mighty. But though it seemed most unlikely that the princess would ever behold her hero, lo, it was written in the stars to the contrary, and that which is written, shall it not surely come to pass? So at least believed the Persians, and so happened it unto Rostem and Tamine. For presently it came to pass that upon a certain morning Rostem, in faraway Persia, awoke from his slumbers unrefreshed, after a restless night of dreaming. Concluding, therefore, that his muscles were in need of exercise, there being no enemies to fight, the hero resolved to go off upon a long hunting trip. So filling his quiver with arrows, he saddled Rakush and set out for the beautiful wilds that border upon Turan. Now, arrived at the hunting ground, Rostem found good sport, for the plain was covered with great herds of wild asses that roamed at will from the sullen grandeur of the uplands to the fair vales below. Setting spurs to Rakush, therefore, gaily the hero pursued them through wood and glen, and often did his quivering darts pierce the glossy skin of the dangerous game. Yea, and oft, too, did his lengthy lasso unfurl, ring upon ring, snaring the wily beasts for his club. So long he hunted, until finally, night drawing on, he said unto Rakush, "Enough, my beauty, enough, for tomorrow will be another day." So, his hunting done, straightway the hero proceeded to light a great fire. Then, making a young tree serve as a spit, he ran it through the body of a nice fat goar, hung it over the fire, and roasted it for his meal. And behold, being deliciously done, hungrily he tore it joint from joint, ate of it his fill, and broke the bones for the marrow. Then, tired with his long day's sport, the weary hunter sought the shade of a thicket and lay down to sleep, fanned by the plumes of the glorious palms above his head, and lulled to rest by the cooing doves and sunbirds that fluttered through their swinging crowns. Yea, and watched over by faithful Rakush, who wandered never far from his sleeping master. Now while Rustam peacefully slept, the hand of fate was busy weaving into the pattern of his life some new threads. For on this eventful day, a traveler on his way to Samengan had beheld the mighty one hunting. So it came to pass that having arrived at the court, he told the astonishing news, which spread until it reached the ears of Fatima, who at once rushed to inform her young mistress. Now at first Tamine, upon hearing this story, was incredulous, but having summoned the traveler into her presence, her doubts were soon dispelled, for he said, "Gracious princess, behold, as I crossed the great salt plains upon the border of the kingdom this day, I encountered a solitary huntsman, mounted upon a magnificent charger, and towering in his saddle like a giant among men. More like unto a god than mortal man, Surely this could have been no other than Rustem, the champion of the world, and his famous war horse Rakush. For verily there exist not two such mighty heroes in the world. Of that I am certain. Thus spake the traveller, and being dismissed, Fatima, all excitement, cried eagerly unto her mistress, O Rose of the world, rejoice! For behold, thy hero draweth near, and yet thine eyes may be gladdened by his coming. For surely no man could see the mighty Rustem and mistake him for another, since, as the traveller saith, in all the world there are no two such, nay, nor methinks in heaven either. Now hearing these words, the heart of Tamine leaped and rejoiced like unto that of a gay singing bird, as embracing Fatima, she exclaimed joyously, her soft dark eyes shining like stars, Fatima, old dragon, listen and admire, for behold, thy bright pomegranate flower hath determined to gaze upon this glorious Persian sun, and if it withereth all her gay petals, and the stars decree that thou must help her. But Fatima, hearing these words, quickly repented of her impetuosity, for right well she knew the wilfulness of her mistress, and she feared unto what it might lead. Therefore she replied unto Tamine, Pearl of my heart, be not foolish, for how is it possible for thee to accomplish the desire of thy heart? The great Rustem is traveling north, and it is not probable either that he will visit our court or delay his journey. How then canst thou hope to see him? Now thus questioned, for a time Tamine was silent. But being a young woman of some resource, she was not to be dismayed by obstacles which might have deterred smaller souls. For had she not all her life been hoping against hope for just this opportunity? And now that it had come, was she to sit quietly down, allowing it to pass by unimproved? Verily nay. For some minutes, however, the princess did sit down, thinking hard. But presently, springing gaily to her feet, a mischievous light sparkling and dancing in her wonderful dark eyes, she cried, Kiss me, Fatima, kiss me, for verily thou beholdest before thee the happiest princess in the whole wide world. Soon I shall see, and perhaps win, the hero of my dreams, and thou, too, methinks will rejoice once more to behold thy country's champion. Now let not thine eyes pop out of thy head, old dragon, neither be thou dismayed, for I shall not go forth unto the great Rustem, but he shall come unto me. For look you, the plan is quite simple, since we have only to take captive Rakush, when the hero will come quickly enough to recover his glorious steed. Alas, the proposition of stealing Rakush was unto Fatima as daring and awful an idea as the thought of stealing Rustem himself. But realizing that it was useless to oppose her young mistress, she replied not, save by a deep groan. Ignoring the groan, however, the princess continued, Listen now, my dear old Fatima, for verily the plot is a famous one, but it must be carried out tonight, before Rustem hath departed, else it will be too late. Now methinks that not by strength, but by stratagem, must Rakush the terrible be captured. Therefore, when darkness covereth the land tonight, we will send forth 6 wily herdsmen, mounted upon light, swift horses, spurring them on to the enterprise, by offering them princely rewards if successful. They must be, of course, men expert with the lasso, and they must entrap, without harming, Rakush while Rustem sleeps, returning with him unto the royal stables before dawn. Thus elaborated Tamine her plan unto Fatima, who, relieved that it threatened no danger to the princess, nevertheless protested loudly, tearing her hair and clothes, weeping and lamenting bitterly. But of course she ended by doing the will of her mistress, as did also the men chosen, for well they knew that any service faithfully performed would be liberally rewarded by the Princess Tamine. Meanwhile, little dreamed the mighty Rustem, as he soundly slept on his bed of moss that night, after his famous day's hunting, of the filmy web that this bright-eyed princess was securely weaving about him. Yea, and even intelligent Rakush, though he slept not, little suspected that for long 7 dark figures had stealthily stalked him throughout the night. For the Tartar warriors who followed him knowing quite well that no easy task was involved in carrying out the commands of their princess, proceeded most cautiously. Finally, however, advancing stealthily, the 7 clever ones tried to take their prize unawares by throwing a lasso over his head. But in vain, for the noise of the uncoiling lariat piercing unto the ear of Rakush, dexterously he avoided the cruel cord, standing with his ears alert and pawing feet of anger. Now for a second thus he stood, then having located his enemy, like a lion he sprang upon them, striking 2 of the foe dead with a single stroke of his forefeet, and savagely biting off the head of a 3rd. Thus 3 of the company were safely disposed of, and the brave Rakush was not yet taken. Nor would he have been, for never yet had man or demon entrapped or overcome the glorious steed. But for the sake of the beautiful princess, the stars decreed it. So presently, after a hard fight, the 4 succeeded in entangling him with their lassos, and thus it came to pass that just before the day dawned, the proud war horse of Rostem was led, gagged and blindfolded, into the stables of the king of Samengan. And behold, when the Princess Tamine from her balcony at last beheld the famous war horse loom up along the shadowy road, so great was her joy that, regardless of the fact that Rakush was tossing his head, stamping his hoofs, and snorting protests like an angry dragon, she would have flown down to welcome him with soft caress, had not the faithful Fatima urged that such a step might undo all that had been accomplished. But though the dawn brought joy unto Tamine, its message unto Rostem was that of sorrow. For behold, when he called unto Rakush, no answering nay rang out the glad reply. Thinking, however, that his steed had perhaps but strayed beyond the sound of his first gentle call, the hero quickly came out into the open, calling unto Rakush in a voice of thunder. But still there came no answer. Then was the heart of the mighty one troubled, for well he knew that his faithful steed had not willingly strayed away. Now in his dismay he said unto himself, "What a dilemma! For now I must go on foot, carrying my quiver and my great club, this heavy helmet and coat of mail, and my life-destroying sword. And seeing me thus, how the Tartars will scoff, saying among themselves, 'Behold the mighty Rostem, while he slept, someone must have stolen his horse.' Now thus shall I be put to shame before my enemies, that which never yet hath happened unto Rostem." Thus communing with himself, busily the hero searched for some trace of his missing steed, and not in vain, for at last he detected the footprints of a scuffle down by the stream that murmured at the foot of the shady glen. Here great hoof marks pointed out the field of battle, the ground being plowed up on all sides, indicating how desperately the mighty steed had resisted his wily captors. Then farther on could be traced the steps of Rakush between 2 other horses, closely followed by a 3rd, which plainly said unto Rostem that his faithful companion had been stolen. And now, boiling over with rage and sorrow, the heart of Rostem beat to but one refrain: vengeance, vengeance upon the captors of Rakush. Pausing not, however, quickly he followed the traces of his horse's hoofs, and lo, they led him unto the gates of Samengan. Then Rostem, perceiving whither the footprints led, sware unto heaven a great oath, and he said, "By the sun, and moon, and stars, I swear that if aught of harm hath come unto Rakush through this king or his people, verily the thief shall pay for it with his head." Meanwhile, knowing naught of the capture of Rakush, as Rostem approached the shining turrets of the city, great was the astonishment of the king and those about him when they beheld the manner of his coming. Nevertheless, they hurried forth to greet their distinguished guest. The king saying unto him, "O glorious Peliva, never hath Samengan been so honored in a guest, and lo, her king saith unto thee, Welcome. But how happeneth it that the mighty Rostem cometh unto us afoot and unattended? If misfortune hath befallen, behold, we are all at thy service." But unto this courteous greeting Rostem replied coldly, relating briefly unto the king all that had come to pass. Then becoming more angry as he talked, once more the hero sware that many heads should quit their trunks if his charger were not returned unto him right speedily, void of harm. Then the king, seeing that Rostem was beside himself with anger, spake words of comfort unto the hero, for he knew how dear unto him was his glorious steed. And he said, O hero of heroes, be not so disturbed in thy spirit, for verily anger profiteth nothing. It is by charming that one lureth the serpent from his hole. As for Rakush, if still within the limits of my reign, the well-known courser shall be thine again. For Rakush never can remain concealed, no more than Rostem on the battlefield. Take courage, therefore, and be of good cheer, for soon thy glorious other self shall be restored unto thee, and all will be well. As for the thief, when detected he shall be placed in thy hands, to slay or to spare, according to thy good pleasure. But as for Rustem, for this one night at least, he must tarry at Samangan as our honored guest. So being satisfied with these promises, Rustem put away all suspicion from his mind and became the king's guest. Then all day they feasted and made merry, beguiling the hours with wine and sweet words. Nor could the king sufficiently honor his guest, though he encompassed him with music and song, and waited upon him with his own hands, as though he were his slave. And behold, when night was fallen, the monarch himself led Rustem onto a couch perfumed with musk and roses, bidding him slumber peacefully until morning, when he should again be made glad in Rakush, his steed. Now thus delightfully couched, Rustem slept dreamlessly until the star of morning stood high in the arch of heaven. Then suddenly there fell upon his ear the murmur of soft, womanly voices, which caused the hero to start up in confused amazement. Seeing nothing, however, he closed his eyes again, for he thought that he had dreamed. But though his conclusion was natural, the hero dreamed not, for presently the heavy curtains were drawn softly aside, and there stepped within the chamber a slave bearing a lamp perfumed with amber. And following after, her veil but half concealing her lovely face, Rustem beheld the fairest maiden his eyes had ever gazed upon. Now for a moment the lovely vision lingered upon the threshold, poised like a frightened bird for hasty flight, the rich color suffusing her olive cheek, her dark eyes beaming beneath their splendid lashes, and her pomegranate mouth, flower soft and sensitive, slightly parted. Then, gaining courage, slowly she advanced toward the hero, and as she moved, fragrance was scattered from her robes, and her long black ringlets, musk-perfumed, seemed unto Rustem as fateful as the warrior's Kamund. Yet, though enchanted, the warrior sighed, for again he thought he but dreamed. But even as he would have settled himself once more unto slumber, behold, like music upon his ear, fell the soft voice of Tamine, bidding Fatima retire to the distant window. Now this fully awoke the young warrior, who, springing quickly from his couch, gazed in astonished delight at his enchanting visitor. Then Tamine spoke in the soft, velvety tones she could use so effectively when she chose, and she said, "My lord Rustem, thou beholdest before thee the Princess Tamine, daughter of the king, and she hath come thus into thy presence because the need is urgent. For she would crave thy pardon for a great wrong which she hath done unto thee, and which, she heareth, carrieth with it a fearful penalty." Now, amazed at this most surprising confession poured forth from tempting lips, molded for love's recompense alone, for a second the valiant Rustem was silenced by the wonder and unexpectedness of it all. Quickly recovering himself, however, he replied unto the maiden, "Thou, fair princess, thou hast done me a wrong? Truly I know not what wrong thou canst have done me, unless it be the mischief wrought by thy bright eyes, since they have shone so radiantly upon me. It is true, my heart whispers unto me that thy wondrous beauty hath caught me in its snare. But if that be thy sin, it carrieth with it a delightful penalty, one which thou needest not fear." Now this reply, so unlike that of a mighty warrior, caused a roguish smile to play about the fascinating lips of the Princess Tamine, who, casting upon the speaker one bright admiring glance from her sparkling eyes, then modestly dropped them, replying demurely unto this gallant speech, "Who knoweth, my lord, but that, perchance, I would gladly add that theft unto the other. But greatly I fear that thou wilt consider my first offense the greater. For it was I, and none other, who had stolen from thee Rakush, thy steed of battle, who even now slumbereth peacefully in the royal stables." So spake Tamine, and though, as we know, her words were true, yet was it long before she could persuade the master of Rakush that she did not jest. When she finally convinced him, however, so great was his joy in knowing Rakush safe and unharmed, that, behold, he forgot to be angry with the thief. But after all, who could blame him? For the thief was very fair, and she confessed with a voice that rivaled the magic notes of the bulbul chanting unto his mate. And besides, the master of Rakush had it in his heart to ask a great boon of the princess, and this time he remembered that not by anger, but by charming, one lureth a bird from the bush. So smiling, he said unto Tamine, "Fair princess, behold, thou standest before thy judge, convicted of 2 serious crimes. 2 conditions must thou fulfill, therefore, if thou wouldst obtain thy pardon. First, the judge must be allowed to gaze upon the face of the fair culprit, else how can he administer suitable punishment? And second, he must be informed as to the motive of the theft, for that puzzle hath yet to be unravelled." Now at this embarrassing sentence, the lovely Tamine stood silent before her judge, looking indeed like a culprit, fostering half a desire to flee. But presently, rallying her forces, she replied bravely unto the mighty one, though her soft voice trembled, and she looked not up. "My lord Rostem, though news unto thee, since thou art a mighty warrior, I suppose it is yet true that every maiden hath her hero. Now it is owing to Fatima there, who is a Persian, that I have mine, a hero of whose fame and valorous deeds I have dreamed my life long, whose like ne'er was and ne'er will be again, whose glory reacheth even unto the stars. And thou must know also, O mighty one, that every maiden longeth to gaze upon the face of the only hero in the world for her. That is why I stole thy horse. And now, since thou knowest my utmost guilt, findest thou my crime too great for pardon?" But unto this plea, for some minutes, Rustem replied not, for persistently his heart kept singing, "The only hero in the world for her? The only hero in the world for her!" Now praise was no new thing unto the champion of the world, but never before had it been offered with such subtle charm. And besides, with joy the warrior recognized that here was a spirit akin unto his own in its dauntlessness and longings after the best. Drawing near unto the princess, therefore, the only hero in the world said unto her softly, "Fair pomegranate flower, one of the conditions truly thou hast fulfilled, but the other must be met also, for verily my eyes are hungry for full sight of lips that can murmur words so sweet to hear." But the princess, drawing closer the long white veil which half concealed her face, stepped quickly back, saying proudly unto the eager Rustem, "Nay, nay, my lord, that is a privilege I grant only unto the man who weddeth me." Now saying this, slowly the princess moved toward the curtains, as though she would go. But Rustem, detaining her, cried out impetuously, "O pearl among women, stay, for verily my heart hath wakened, and calleth unto thee for its mate. Only consent therefore, and tomorrow we will be wed." But though these words sounded unto Tamine like a paean of victory, she received them coldly. For well she knew that no man, least of all a warrior, careth for what he can win too easily. And then it was that Rustem, in whom contradiction ever roused a fiery purpose to obtain his will, vowed again and yet again that he could not live without her, that he would wed but her, and that before the morrow's sun had set, that from henceforth honor and praise and glory would be as ashes unto his lips, unless he shared with his moon of beauty. So now, having thus aroused desire, softly the princess drew aside her veil. Then, before the enraptured Rustem had wakened to the danger, like a gay hummingbird, swiftly away she flew, leaving in his hands her veil, which he in his eagerness had seized, lest she hide that lovely face again too soon. And as she fled, like chimes of bells, there floated back the sound of merry laughter, which but fanned the flame glowing already so brightly in the awakened heart of the hero, left gazing so ruefully upon love's only token, the dainty, fragrant, cruel film of lace. Now regarding it tenderly, the warrior smiled and said, "Behold, the gay young singing bird hath flown, leaving her pretty wing in the too rough hand of her captor. But by the sun and moon and stars, I swear that yet shall she be mine, for mighty in love shall Rustem be, as well as in deeds of valor." Consequently, when morning dawned and the hero once more beheld the king, ceremoniously he asked for Tamine's hand in marriage. Yea, and the monarch of Samengan listened to him gladly, for was it not Rustem the mighty who sued? And did he not know but too well the heart of his moon of beauty? So that very day was the marriage bower crowned with roses and decked with white lilies, while the royal abode was flooded with music and sunshine to grace the glad wedding of the Princess Tamine. And when all was over, verily it seemed unto Rustem and his pretty singing bird as if the world, like some vast tidal wave, had rolled away, leaving them alone with their happiness upon the golden shores of the land of delight. Now thus it was that Tamine, princess of Samengan, obtained her heart's desire. And behold, for one bright summer month, she tasted such happiness as is seldom vouchsafed, even unto the children of Ormuzd. Wandering into the myrtle groves, or strolling together in the shady forest, the princess now heard from the hero's own lips marvelous tales of adventure, and the days passed for both like a happy dream. But alas, in the book of fate it is written that pure happiness is not for mortals, and so, when one bright moon had run her course, relentlessly sorrow, joy's somber twin, invaded this land of delight. And behold, not suddenly, but with stealth, the invader drew nigh, attacking first the hero of battles. For gradually Rustem became restless and impatient with his life of inactivity, longing intensely for the excitement of warfare and adventure to which he was accustomed and for which he was formed. For alas, nature, in giving unto him his giant frame and mighty muscles, his valorous heart, and his soul that joyed above all else in battle, had planned and destined the mighty son of Zal to shine through all the ages, not as a lover, but as the type of the perfect warrior. Now slowly this truth was brought home unto Tamine, as she noted the ever-increasing restlessness of her hero, which even she could not always still, though she knew that he loved her tenderly. And though she spake not of it, her heart became burdened with sorrow, for she knew that the time was now not far off when Rustem would go back into his own people and life, perhaps forgetting her in the more powerful attractions of war, while she must needs love him forever. The Story of Rustem and Other Persian Fairy Tales from Ferdowsi by Elizabeth D. Renninger. Rustem's Romance.
The Goblin of Adachigahara. Long, long ago, there was a large plain called Adachigahara in the province of Mutsu in Japan. This place was said to be haunted by a cannibal goblin who took the form of an old woman. From time to time, many travelers disappeared and were never heard of more, and the old women round the charcoal braziers in the evenings, and the girls washing the household rice at the wells in the mornings, whispered dreadful stories of how the missing folk had been lured to the goblin's cottage and devoured, for the goblin lived only on human flesh. No one dared to venture near the haunted spot after sunset, and all those who could avoided it in the daytime, and travelers were warned of the dreaded place. One day, as the sun was setting, a priest came to the plain. He was a belated traveler, and his robe showed that he was a Buddhist pilgrim walking from shrine to shrine to pray for some blessing, or to crave for forgiveness of sins. He had apparently lost his way, and as it was late, he met no one who could show him the road or warn him of the haunted spot. He had walked the whole day, and was now tired and hungry, and the evenings were chilly, for it was late autumn, and he began to be very anxious to find some house where he could obtain a night's lodging. He found himself lost in the midst of the large plain, and looked about in vain for some sign of human habitation. At last, after wandering about for some hours, he saw a clump of trees in the distance, and through the trees he caught sight of the glimmer of a single ray of light. He exclaimed with joy, "Oh, surely that is some cottage where I can get a night's lodging." Keeping the light before his eyes, he dragged his weary, aching feet as quickly as he could towards the spot, and soon came to a miserable-looking little cottage. As he drew near, he saw that it was in a tumble-down condition. The bamboo fence was broken, and weeds and grass pushed their way through the gaps. The paper screens, which serve as windows and doors in Japan, were full of holes, and the posts of the house were bent with age and seemed scarcely able to support the old thatched roof. The hut was open, and by the light of an old lantern, an old woman sat industriously spinning. The pilgrim called to her across the bamboo fence and said, "Oba-san," old woman, "good evening. I am a traveler. Please excuse me, but I have lost my way and do not know what to do, for I have nowhere to rest tonight. I beg you to be good enough to let me spend the night under your roof." The old woman, as soon as she heard herself spoken to, stopped spinning, rose from her seat, and approached the intruder. "I am very sorry for you. You must indeed be distressed to have lost your way in such a lonely spot so late at night. Unfortunately, I cannot put you up, for I have no bed to offer you, and no accommodation whatsoever for a guest in this poor place." "Oh, that does not matter," said the priest. "All I want is a shelter under some roof for the night, and if you will be good enough just to let me lie on the kitchen floor, I shall be grateful. I am too tired to walk further tonight, so I hope you will not refuse me, otherwise I shall have to sleep out on the cold plain." And in this way he pressed the old woman to let him stay. She seemed very reluctant, but at last she said, "Very well, I will let you stay here. I can offer you a very poor welcome only. But come in now, and I will make a fire, for the night is cold." The pilgrim was only too glad to do as he was told. He took off his sandals and entered the hut. The old woman then brought some sticks of wood and lit the fire, and bade her guest draw near and warm himself. "You must be hungry after your long tramp," said the old woman. "I will go and cook some supper for you." She then went to the kitchen to cook some rice. After the priest had finished his supper, the old woman sat down by the fireplace, and they talked together for a long time. The pilgrim thought to himself that he had been very lucky to come across such a kind, hospitable old woman. At last the wood gave out, and as the fire died slowly down, he began to shiver with cold, just as he had done when he had arrived. "I see you are cold," said the old woman. "I will go out and gather some wood, for we have used it all. You must stay and take care of the house while I am gone." "No, no," said the pilgrim. "Let me go instead, for you are old, and I cannot think of letting you go out to get wood for me this cold night." The old woman shook her head and said, "You must stay quietly here, for you are my guest." Then she left him and went out. In a minute she came back and said, "You must sit where you are and not move, and whatever happens, don't go near or look into the inner room. Now mind what I tell you." "If you tell me not to go near the back room, of course I won't," said the priest, rather bewildered. The old woman then went out again, and the priest was left alone. The fire had died out, and the only light in the hut was that of a dim lantern. For the first time that night, he began to feel that he was in a weird place, and the old woman's words, "Whatever you do, don't peep into the back room," aroused his curiosity and his fear. What hidden thing could be in that room that she did not wish him to see? For some time, the remembrance of his promise to the old woman kept him still, but at last he could no longer resist his curiosity to peep into the forbidden place. He got up and began to move slowly towards the back room. Then the thought that the old woman would be very angry with him if he disobeyed her made him come back to his place by the fireside. As the minutes went slowly by and the old woman did not return, he began to feel more and more frightened and to wonder what dreadful secret was in the room behind him. He must find out. "She will not know that I have looked unless I tell her. I will just have a peep before she comes back," said the man to himself. With these words he got up on his feet, for he had been sitting all this time in Japanese fashion with his feet under him, and stealthily crept towards the forbidden spot. With trembling hands he pushed back the sliding door and looked in. What he saw froze the blood in his veins. The room was full of dead men's bones, and the walls were splashed and the floor was covered with human blood. In one corner, skull upon skull rose to the ceiling. In another was a heap of arm bones. In another, a heap of leg bones. The sickening smell made him faint. He fell backwards with horror, and for some time lay in a heap with fright on the floor, a pitiful sight. He trembled all over, and his teeth chattered, and he could hardly crawl away from the dreadful spot. "How horrible!" he cried out. "What awful den have I come to in my travels? May Buddha help me, or I am lost. Is it possible that that kind old woman is really the cannibal goblin? When she comes back, she will show herself in her true character and eat me up at one mouthful." With these words, his strength came back to him, and snatching up his hat and staff, he rushed out of the house as fast as his legs could carry him. Out into the night he ran, his one thought to get as far as he could from the goblin's haunt. He had not gone far when he heard steps behind him, and a voice crying, "Stop! Stop!" He ran on, redoubling his speed, pretending not to hear. As he ran, he heard the steps behind him come nearer and nearer, and at last he recognized the old woman's voice, which grew louder and louder as she came nearer. "Stop! Stop, you wicked man! Why did you look into the forbidden room?" The priest quite forgot how tired he was, and his feet flew over the ground faster than ever. Fear gave him strength, for he knew that if the goblin caught him, he would soon be one of her victims. With all his heart, he repeated the prayer to Buddha, "Namu Amida Butsu, Namu Amida Butsu." And after him rushed the dreadful old hag, her hair flying in the wind, and her face changing with rage into the demon that she was. In her hand she carried a large, blood-stained knife, and she still shrieked after him, "Stop! Stop!" At last, when the priest felt he could run no more, the dawn broke, and with the darkness of night the goblin vanished, and he was safe. The priest now knew that he had met the goblin of Adachigahara, the story of whom he had often heard, but never believed to be true. He felt that he owed his wonderful escape to the protection of Buddha, to whom he had prayed for help. So he took out his rosary, and bowing his head as the sun rose, he said his prayers and made his thanksgiving earnestly. He then set forward for another part of the country, only too glad to leave the haunted plain behind him. End of The Goblin of Adachigahara by Yae Theodora Ozaki. Recorded by Colleen McMahon.
Chapter 7 of A Book of Giants, Tales of Very Tall Men, of Myth, Legend, History, and Science. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daryl Hanson. A Book of Giants, Tales of Very Tall Men, of Myth, Legend, History, and Science, by Henry Wisham Lanier. Chapter 7 Og, King of Bashan. The Hebrew chroniclers tell us that the giants of their land were the children of fallen angels, who took to themselves wives from the beautiful daughters of men. When these huge beings had consumed the possessions of their neighbors, they began to devour even the human beings themselves, and from this horrible example, men came to kill and eat birds, animals, and fishes. Of these terrific and wicked ones, merely to glance at whom made one's heart grow weak. The most celebrated was Og. His mother, Enoch, was a daughter of Adam. Like all of his race, he was by nature half mortal. For being part angel, part human, these monsters, after a very long life, found themselves with but half a body, the rest having withered away, and with the prospect of remaining forever in this uncomfortable state, they were wont either to plunge into the sea or to end this miserable half-existence by means of a magic herb, the secret of which had been transmitted by their celestial ancestors. Og, however, was destined, in this as in other matters, for a different fate from that of his brethren. When the wickedness and arrogance of the Cainites brought the flood upon the earth, Noah, as commanded, gathered his family and the animals into the ark he had built. All the rest of the miserable folk perished in the waters, with the single exception of the giant Og. The latter had persuaded Noah to save him by promising that he and his descendants would, in return, serve the family of Noah forever. But when they came to embark, it was discovered that the vessel was not large enough to accommodate this huge creature, so he was permitted to sit on top of the ark. And during those weary months when the waters covered the face of the earth, those within passed food to the giant through a hole in the roof. There are indeed writers who declare that Og escaped because his stature was such that the deluge at its deepest reached only to his knees, he being accustomed to drink water direct from the clouds. In fact, Abba Saul avers, "I once hunted a stag which fled into the thigh bone of a dead man. I pursued it and ran along 3 parasangs, about 8 miles, of the thigh bone, yet had not yet reached its end." And this bone proved to be a portion of Og's skeleton. In Moses' time, however, the giant's great iron bedstead, "Is it not in Rabboth of the children of Ammon?" was a mere 13 or 14 feet long. Whatever his height, his breadth was half as great, instead of only 1/3 as in the normal man. There was also one animal too large to enter the ark, the reem, or unicorn. It was therefore tied to the stern and ran on behind. Undoubtedly, this difficult mode of traveling proved fatal, since we have no authentic record of that beast since then. Og had better fortune. Whether wading or bestriding the vessel, he won through, for we find him again some hundreds of years later as the slave of Abraham, to whom he had been presented by Nimrod. He was, say the rabbins, that very steward called Eleazar in the Bible account. Finally, after these centuries of servitude, his master freed him as a reward for bringing back Rebekah as a bride for his son Isaac. God also rewarded him in this world, that this wicked wight might not lay claim to a reward in the world to come. He therefore made a king of him. He had also received another doubtful reward for a difficult service. Hearing that Abraham's nephew Lot had been carried away into captivity, he sped with the news and stood by when all others were fearful, thinking in his heart that his master would hasten to his kinsman's help and would be killed by the marauding kings, which would leave the beautiful Sarah as his own prize. Consequently, he was granted another 500 years of life, but on the conclusion of that term he was to be completely mortal. Long did this gigantic monarch of gigantic adventures reign in Bashan, east of the Jordan River. 60 walled cities did he found, and great was his power and fame in all that land. Of his own race to the south was Sihon, king of the Amorites, and across the Dead Sea was another family of his brood, Anak, and his sons and daughters. All the kings of Canaan paid tribute to Og of Bashan in return for the defense of their borders by his might. Even had he known of it, he would have been little troubled to hear that the Israelite slaves of Pharaoh had escaped from bondage in Egypt and were slowly moving northward through the desert towards Canaan. Great indeed would have been his amusement had he seen the slinking spies sent out by Moses when they reached the city of 4, Kiryat Arba, or Hebron, where dwelt Anak and his mighty brood. At the mere shout of one of the sons, the spies fell down as dead men, and one day the Israelites heard the Anakim roar to each other as they looked toward the trembling strangers. "There are grasshoppers by the trees that have the semblance of men." But in spite of the timorous report of most of these scouts, "We be not able to go up against these people, for they are stronger than we," the day arrived when word came to Og that his band of wanderers had smitten the Amorites and killed Sihon and his son, and captured the impregnable city of Heshbon and taken possession of all that region. This brought the invaders to the very edge of Og's dominions, and when they had rested, they pressed on against the stronghold of Edrei. Toward night, they reached the outskirts, and Moses prepared to attack the following day. At dawn he rose and went forward to reconnoiter, but as he looked ahead through the grayness, he cried out, "Behold, in the night they have built up a new wall about the city." Then the light grew gradually stronger, and he perceived that what he had taken for a new fortification was the giant king himself, who sat upon the wall with his feet touching the earth. Sore dismayed was the Israelitish host at sight of this incredible being, who gazed upon them with scornful confidence. Even Moses himself hesitated and began to feel doubtful. Not only did ordinary weapons seem unavailing against such a prodigy, but he reflected that this giant was reputed to have lived for hundreds of years. Surely he could never have attained so great an age, had he not performed meritorious deeds. He reflected, too, that Og was the only one of the original giant brood who had escaped the sword of the angel Amraphel, and it seemed therefore as if he must be under some sort of divine protection. While he thus communed with himself and sought for guidance in prayer, he seemed to hear from on high a direct answer to his questionings. "What matters to thee Og's gigantic stature? He is as a green leaf in thy hand." At this he took courage, yet he could not understand in what manner he might come at the monster, since apparently no weapon he could handle would come anywhere near reaching to his knees. So he waited, considering this matter, and presently the giant bestirred himself and set about bringing the issue to a close in characteristic fashion. For, noting closely the size of the encampment of the Israelites, he heaved up a huge rock like a veritable mountain, vast enough to cover the entire camp. Bearing this upon his head, he strode forward, clearly intending to crush the entire force of his enemies at one blow. Ill would it have fared with the band under Moses that day, had they been dependent upon their own might alone. But as the giant advanced, and all waited in terror for the catastrophe, the colossal mass of rock was seen to settle down over his head. He stood still, blinded and bewildered, endeavoring to throw off his imprisoning bulk, but all his efforts were unavailing. Then Moses, perceiving that the enemy was delivered into his hands, seized a mighty axe and ran forward, and leaped into the air higher than an ordinary man's head, and dealt such a blow upon Og's leg that he crashed to earth with the rock on top of him. Thus died Og, king of Bashan, last of the giants who were before the flood. And the warriors of Israel fell upon the army which had accompanied him, and conquered it utterly, and took possession of all the land. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of a Book of Giants. Tales of very tall men of myth, legend, history, and science. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daryl Hanson. A Book of Giants. Tales of very tall men of myth, legend, history, and science, by Henry Wisham Lanier. Chapter 8. A Son of Anak. There was war many years between the children of Israel and the Philistines. And it came to pass, while Saul was king, that the Philistines gathered together a great army, and marched into the land of Judah against the Israelites, and encamped in a plain near Shocho. So Saul also drew out his army, and hurried forward, and occupied a hill overlooking this plain, whereupon the Philistines were forced to leave their position, and to establish themselves on another hill, across the valley of Elah from Saul's camp. While the armies thus faced each other, there came one day out of the ranks of the Philistines a champion named Goliath. Very terrible he was to behold, for he was of the race of those sons of Anak, for fear of whom the Israelites under Moses had murmured and had been therefore condemned to wander 40 years in the wilderness. And while Joshua had finally led them across the Jordan after the death of Moses, and had smitten the Anakim and overcome them, there had remained 3 cities where their seed still dwelt, Gaza and Gath and Ashdod. And it was from Gath that this Goliath had come with the invading army. He was half as tall again as an ordinary man, something over 9 feet. His brazen breastplate alone weighed as much as a man. On his head was a helmet of brass, and he carried over his shoulder a mighty spear which looked like a weaver's beam, and the head of which alone weighed 25 pounds. Brazen greaves were upon his legs, and he bore a shield of gleaming brass. This daunting figure advanced boldly into the plain, between the 2 armies drawn up in battle array, and in a great voice cried out, "Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants of Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." Now this was quite customary in the olden days. Many a great issue had been decided by the combat of 2 champions. Moreover, there were brave men enough in the army of the Israelites, for Saul had had war all his days against the children of Moab and the Amalekites, against Ammon, Edom, and Zoab. And when he had seen any strong or valiant fighter among his people, he had straightway taken him unto him. But at the sight of this huge brazen warrior, his hardiest veterans turned pale and trembled. For was it not a saying passed on from father to son for many generations? "Who shall stand before the sons of Anak?" So, among all those thousands, there was not found one so much as to answer the giant's challenge, which, when he perceived, he reviled them and returned to his own people. The next day he came forth again, morning and evening, and the day after that, and each day following, always repeating his challenge in the face of all the force, and taunting them bitterly. Wherefore Saul was greatly troubled, for he knew well that this open fear of the giant would fight more overwhelmingly against his soldiers when battle was joined than the mighty Philistine himself and all his host. He offered, therefore, great riches to any man who would go forth against the challenger. Whosoever should slay him should have the king's daughter to wife, and his father's house should be free in Israel. Yet even this could not prevail upon any to stand before the Philistine, so that for 40 days he braved and insulted the whole army without response. Now there were 3 brothers among those who followed Saul, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah. They were sons of Jesse, who dwelt but 10 or 12 miles from the battlefield, and the hills near Bethlehem. This Jesse had a 4th son, David, who was but a stripling, and tended his father's sheep. He was a ruddy youth, of fair gaze and beautiful to look upon. So cunning a musician was he, that when an evil spirit of melancholy had descended upon the king, one of his servants had brought the boy to harp to his master, and the youth's skill in charming away this evil spirit had given him favor in Saul's sight, so that he had kept him before him and made him his armor-bearer. But when the 3 older sons of Jesse had joined the army gathered against the Philistines, David had returned to his duties with his father's flocks. It chanced at this time that Jesse called David to him. "Take now said he.
"This bushel of parched corn, and these 10 loaves, and carry them swiftly to the camp, to thy brethren. And carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how thy brethren fare, and bring me word again."
So David arose very early in the morning, and left the sheep with a keeper, and went as his father had commanded to the camp by the valley of Elah. It was an easy journey for one who spent his days abroad with the sheep, and the sun was but lately up when he reached the encampment. All was noise and confusion as he arrived, for both hosts were setting themselves in battle array, army against army. So the youth left his burdens with the keeper of the supplies, and ran in among the ranks until he found his brethren, and said unto them, "Peace be with you." As he talked with them, the Philistine champion appeared on the opposite slope. According to his wont, he challenged the whole army and reviled them, while the men of Israel drew back, sore afraid as before. David heard his insults, and heard also the talk of those who stood by, what great things King Saul had promised to any who might overthrow him, and how long his boast and defiance had gone unquestioned. "What shall be done," he inquired of his neighbors, "to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" They answered and told him what the king had promised.
"So shall it be done to the man that killeth him."
His eldest brother Eliab heard these questionings, and his anger was kindled against David. He turned upon him, saying, "Why comest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and forwardness. Thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle." "What have I now done?" replied the youth. "Was there not a cause for my coming?" He turned away and again asked the nearest soldier of the affair, receiving the same answer. And someone came to Saul, relating the words the stripling had spoken. Saul sent for him. As soon as he stood in the king's presence, David broke out, pointing to the distant figure of the giant. "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine."
"Thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him,"
answered Saul.
"for thou art but a youth, and he is a man of war from his childhood up."
"Thy servant kept his father's sheep," urged the young man. "And there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after the lion, and smote him, and delivered the lamb out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by the hair, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God." When Saul saw the eagerness and confidence of this handsome young shepherd, he was reminded of the deed of his son Jonathan, when, accompanied only by his armor-bearer, he had climbed up into the enemy's garrison at Michmash, and slain 20 men within the space of half an acre, and started the rout of the whole army of the Philistines, which had been about to overrun the land.
"Go,"
said he,
"and the Lord be with thee."
So he armed David with his own armor, and put a helmet on his head. And David girded on the king's sword, and tried to walk. But he found himself so unaccustomed to the armor that he said to the king, "I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them." So he removed the armor, and set out in his shepherd's clothes, with his staff in his hand, and his sling hanging from his girdle. This latter was the weapon he knew, and it was by no means to be despised. The plain piece of leather with thongs attached to each end, by means of which a stone could be hurled, was perhaps the very earliest means of fighting at a distance, and it was the traditional arm of more than one nation of the Syrian region. Among the Benjaminites, when they fought with Israel, there were 700 chosen men, left-handed, every one of whom could sling stones at a hair's breadth and not miss. and an expert slinger had the advantage against a warrior armed with sword and spear of being able to deliver an attack long before he himself was threatened. The youth walked to the brook and carefully selected 5 rounded stones of the right size, which he put into the wallet slung over his shoulder. Then, in the full sight of both armies, he advanced against the giant warrior in his gleaming harness, who stood brandishing his great spear and shouting his scorn. Seeing David approach, he came forward, preceded by his shield-bearer. But perceiving only this fresh-faced stripling in his skin garment, he was filled with contempt at such an antagonist.
"Am I a dog,"
he cried,
"that thou comest to me with staves?"
Cursing the youth by his heathen gods, he shouted,
"Come to me, and I will give thy flesh to the fowls of the air, and to the beasts of the field."
Calmly David answered,
Thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into my hand, and I will smite thee, and take thy head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the assembly may know there is a God in Israel."
Enraged at this insolence, the Philistine champion hastened forward to smite down this boaster with one blow. But David ran towards him, and as he ran, he took one of the stones and placed it in his sling. Whirling it about, he hurled it so shrewdly that the stone struck Goliath full in the forehead, burying itself in the skull. Down crashed that giant bulk to earth. The shield-bearer fled, aghast, back to his own lines. Running up to his prostrate adversary, the youth drew the giant's sword from his sheath, and while the multitude looked on in awed silence, he hewed the Philistine's head from his body. At that, the Israelites set up a shout, which echoed from hill to hill. The Philistine host turned and fled in utter panic, while Saul's men slaughtered them all the way to the gates of Gath, making great spoil of their belongings. But David took the giant's sword and placed it in the sanctuary of Nob, where it was to serve him in dire need at a later day. And Saul set him over all his men of war. End of chapter 8.
Legends of Norseland, edited by Mara L. Pratt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Sonrisa, survision.org. Legends of Norseland, The Stolen Wine. There had lain for ages upon ages, hidden away in the great rocky cellar of one of the giant's castles, a cask of wine which had been stolen from the gods. Never before had the gods been able to learn what had become of it, what giant had stolen it, nor in what castle it was hidden. But now that Odin had become all-wise, nothing could be concealed from him. "I know at last where the wine lies hidden," said Odin one day to his son Thor, "and I shall set forth to find it." Thor brought down his hammer with a thud. "Let me go with you," cried he, springing up, "and let me fell to the earth with one blow of my magic hammer the giant who has stolen and has kept hidden all these ages our precious wine." "No," answered Odin, "this time I must go alone. The wine is guarded day and night, and it will not be easy to bring it away, even when I have found it. But watch for me, dear son. One day there will come, beating its wings against the shining gates of our city, a great white eagle. Do not harm the eagle. Open the gates to him, for that eagle will be Odin, returning with the stolen wine to our city of Asgard." Then Odin put aside his sparkling crown and laid down his scepter. His wonderful blue mantle studded with stars and fastened always with a pale crescent moon, he also threw aside, and stepped forth in the garb of a common laborer. "It is in this guise that I shall win my way to the giant's castle," said Odin, and in a second he had passed out from the hall and was gone. It was the giant Suttung that had stolen the wine, and it was in his castle that it had lain hidden all these years. Now of all the strong castles of all the giants, Suttung's castle was the strongest. The cellar was cut into the solid rock. Moreover, 3 sides of the castle rose in solid walls of granite, while the 4th, no less firm and strong, was built of massive blocks bound with hoops and bars and bolts of strongest iron and steel. Now Suttung had a brother, Boj, who was a giant farmer. He kept 9 strong slaves, half giants themselves, to do his work for him. As Odin approached the fields of Boj's farm, he saw the 9 men hard at work. "Your scythes are dull," said he as he drew near. "Yes, but we have no whetstone to sharpen them upon," answered the workmen, the great drops standing out upon their foreheads. "I will sharpen them on mine," said Odin, drawing one from his pocket. "It is a magic whetstone," cried the men as they saw it work. "Give it to us. We need it more than you. Give it to us, give it to us." "Take it then," answered Odin, throwing it high in the air and walking off. It is mine, let me have it, give it to me, I will have it, out of the way, it shall be mine," screamed and quarreled the 9 men as they pushed and crowded, each one determined to catch the whetstone as it came down to earth. At last it fell. Then a fiercer battle followed. The angry men fell upon each other. They dragged and pulled and threw each other to the ground. They pounded each other. They struck at each other with their scythes. On and on they fought. Hour after hour the battle was waged, till at last the sun god, in sheer dismay at so unloving a sight, hid his face behind the hills, and the 9 men lay dead upon the fields. It was an hour later when Odin reached the castle of Boj. "Can you give me shelter for the night?" he asked, as the giant appeared at the door of his castle. "Yes, I can give you shelter, but you must look elsewhere for your breakfast. A strange thing has happened. My 9 slaves, while at work in the field, have fallen in battle upon each other, and have killed each other. None of them is left alive to serve me." "They must have been idle, quarrelsome fellows," answered Odin. "They were indeed," answered Boj. "But how shall I get my work done without them?" "I will do that work for you," answered Odin. "You? There is but one of you, even if you are willing to try," answered Boj, but with little interest. "But I can do the work of any 9 workmen that ever served you." The giant laughed. "Ha! A remarkable workman! Pray, do you ask the wages of 9 men as well?" "I ask no wages," answered Odin. "I only ask that, as my pay when the work is done, you shall give me a draught of wine from the cask hidden in your brother's cellar." Boj stared. "How did you know there is a cask in my brother's cellar?" he gasped. "It is enough that I know it," answered Odin coldly. Boj looked at Odin. "He is better than no man," he thought to himself. "I may as well get what work from him I can, before he finds that no being on earth can enter that cellar or force my brother to give away 1 drop of that wine." "Very well, you may go to work," he said aloud. "I cannot promise you that we can make our way into my brother's cellar, but I will do what I can to help you." "That is all I ask," answered Odin. "Now let me sleep, for I am tired, and if I am to do 9 men's work, I must have 9 men's sleep." "And must you have 9 men's food?" cried Boj. "I think it very likely," answered Odin with a queer smile. "Now let me sleep." "What is your name?" asked Boj of his new workmen when they set forth the next morning to the fields. "You may call me Bolverk," answered Odin. "Will 1 name be enough for all 9 of you?" said Boj with a disagreeable curling of his upper lip. "I will not burden your giant mind with more than 1, Odin answered, a funny little twinkle in his eye. The giant gave a furious grunt. He did not quite know whether his new workman was stupid, or whether under all his seeming meekness it might not be that he was making fun of him. Well, Boj set Bolverk to work, and then, lazy fellow that he was, stretched himself out on a mountainside to watch. "That new workman of mine," he bellowed, calling the attention of a neighbor giant to Odin at work in the field. "Do you see him down there among the corn? He says he can do 9 men's work." "A workman usually thinks himself equal to any 9 other working men," roared back the neighbor. "Of course you have agreed to give him 9 men's wages." Then the 2 giants roared with laughter. They thought that they had said a very bright thing, and very likely they had. It is only because you and I are mere earth children that we do not think so, too. As the days went on, Boj began to laugh less and to wonder more at his strange workmen. He worked on quietly from sunrise till sunset. He did not seem to hurry in his work. He did not work over hours. But strange to say, the work went on as the workman had promised. No 9 men could have done more or could have done it better. It was harvest time when Odin came, the time when Frey, the god of the fields and of all that grows, glides around among his children and covers them over, or gathers in their wealth and beauty. Like the kind, loving father he is, he whispers to them now of Njord, who so soon will come, sweeping across the earth, breathing his cold, freezing breath upon all the world, and covering it over with the cold white sheet that kills the flowers and the fruits. He teaches his children to curl themselves up beneath the earth until the cruel Njord is gone. For Njord seeks to kill the tiny leaves and buds, and shrivel the radiant flowers, that through all the long, warm summer days have lifted their faces so brightly to their good friend, the sun god. Perhaps it was because Frey and Odin worked together that there were such rare crops, and that the harvesting went on so smoothly. Certain it was that all the fields were cleared, the cellars were filled, and all was ready for the long cold months to come, when cruel Njord was king. Even Boj was in good humor. "You are indeed a wonderful workman," he said to Odin, as the last cellar was fastened and he sat down to rest. "You are kind," answered Odin, the funny little twinkle coming again into his eyes. "Perhaps you would be willing to come with me now to your brother, that I may drink from the cask of wine that he keeps so closely guarded in his cellar." Boj began to feel uncomfortable. "He will not allow either you or me so much as look upon that wine. You cannot have it." "Boj," said Odin, growing very tall and godlike, his wonderful eyes flashing with a light like fire, "you promised to do all you could to help me. Come and do as I bid you." Boj stared. His first thought was to kill the workman on the spot, but there was something about him, he hardly knew what, that made him instead rise and follow Odin to his brother's castle. "Tell me which cellar holds the wine," said Odin, when they had reached the brothers' mountain. "This one," answered Boj. "Now take this auger, make a hole with it through the solid wall." Boj obeyed like one in a dream. It was a magic auger. How it worked, how the powdered stone flew in a cloud about his face. "This is a very—" Boj stopped. What had become of his workman? Not a soul was in sight. Odin had disappeared, and to this day the giant never knew what became of him, nor does his brother know who stole his wine from the cellar. The stupid Boj stood staring, now at the auger, now at the hole in the wall. He saw a little worm climb up the wall and disappear through the hole. That is all he ever saw or ever knew. The little worm laughed to itself as it crept out of sight. "You are very stupid, Boj, not to know me." Reaching the inner side of the wall, the little worm stopped to look about. There stood the cask, and beside it sat the daughter of the giant. "Poor girl," said said the worm to himself. "It is a bitter fate to be doomed to sit forever in this wretched dungeon watching your father's stolen treasure. But be happy, soon you will be free. There will be no wine to watch." The young giantess must have heard his words, for she looked up. There, just in front of the hole, the ray of light falling full upon his golden hair, stood a most beautiful youth. He looked so kindly upon her, and his eyes were so full of pity. Her heart went out to him at once. "I am very tired," said he gently, "so very tired. I have come a long, long distance. My home is far from here. I cannot tell you how far, but very, very far. If you would give me just one draught from the cask of wine." The poor girl, grateful for the sound of a friendly voice and for the sight of a human face, arose and lifted the lid for him. Odin leaned over the cask. He put his lips to the wine and drank. "You are very thirsty," said the giantess. "Very," answered Odin, drinking on and on. "You are very thirsty," said the giantess again. "Very," answered Odin, still drinking on and on and on. "You are very thirsty," said the giantess again, this time louder, her voice filled with fear. "Very," answered Odin, still drinking on and on and on and on, nor did he stop till every drop was gone and the cask stood dry and empty. The young giantess, realizing all too late that the wine was stolen, ran to the cellar gateway, shouting, as only a giant can shout, for help. The gateway flew open. In rushed the giants, Boj and his brother. "The wine, they cried. "Stolen, stolen," sobbed the giantess, her sobs shaking even the solid cellar walls. The thief, cried the giants. "Where is the thief?" But there was no thief to be found. There stood the empty cask, but the thief, there was no living creature to be seen. No living creature, I should not have said quite that, for there arose from a darkened corner of the cellar a beautiful great white bird. Its wings brushed against the sides of the gateway as it passed. Then higher and higher up, far, far away beyond the sea, above the clouds it soared, nor rested till its great wings beat against the golden bars of the shining gates of Asgard. Legends of Norseland, The Stolen Wine.
The Ivory City and its Fairy Princess, from Indian Fairy Tales, selected and edited by Joseph Jacobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Ivory City and its Fairy Princess. Recording by Annie Mars. One day, a young prince was out practicing archery with the son of his father's chief vizier, when one of the arrows accidentally struck the wife of a merchant, who was walking about in an upper room of a house close by. The prince aimed at a bird that was perched on the windowsill of that room, and had not the slightest idea that anybody was at hand, or he would not have shot in that direction. Consequently, not knowing what had happened, he and the vizier's son walked away, the vizier's son chaffing him because he had missed the bird. Presently, the merchant went to ask his wife something, and found her lying, to all appearance dead, in the middle of the room, and an arrow fixed in the ground within half a yard of her head. Supposing that she was dead, he rushed to the window and shrieked, "Thieves! Thieves! They killed my wife!" The neighbors quickly gathered, and the servants came running upstairs to see what was the matter. It happened that the woman had fainted, and that there was only a very slight wound to her breast where the arrow had grazed. As soon as the woman recovered her senses, she told them that 2 young men had passed by the palace with their bows and arrows, and that one of them had most deliberately aimed at her as she stood by the window. On hearing this, the merchant went to the king and told him what had taken place. His Majesty was much enraged at such audacious wickedness, and swore that most terrible punishment should be visited on the offender if he could be discovered. He ordered the merchant to go back and ascertain whether his wife could recognize the young men if she saw them again. "Oh, yes," replied the woman, "I should know them again among all the people in the city." "Then," said the king, when the merchant brought back his reply, "tomorrow I will cause all the male inhabitants of the city to pass before your house, and your wife will stand at the window and watch for the man who did this wanton deed." A royal proclamation was issued to this effect. So the next day, all the men and boys of the city, from the age of 10 years upwards, assembled and marched by the house of the merchant. By chance, for they both had been excused from obeying this order, the king's son and the vizier's son were also in the company, and passed by in the crowd. They came to see the tamasha. As soon as these 2 appeared in front of the merchant's window, they were recognized by the merchant's wife, and at once reported to the king. My own son and the son of my chief vizier, exclaimed the king, who had been present from the commencement. What examples for the people! Let them both be executed. Not so, your majesty, said the vizier. I beseech you, let the facts of the case be thoroughly investigated. How is it? He continued, turning to the young men. Why have you done this cruel thing? I shot an arrow at a bird that was sitting on the sill of an open window in yonder house, and missed, answered the prince. I suppose the arrow struck the merchant's wife. Had I known that she or anybody had been near, I should not have shot in that direction. We will speak of this later on, said the king on hearing this answer. Dismiss the people. Their presence is no longer needed. In the evening, his majesty and the vizier had a long and earnest talk about their two sons. The king wished both of them to be executed, but the vizier suggested that the prince should be banished from the country. This was finally agreed to. Accordingly, on the following morning, a little company of soldiers escorted the prince out of the city. When they reached the last custom house, the vizier's son overtook them. He had come with all haste, bringing with him 4 bags of myrrhs on 4 horses. I am come, he said, throwing his arms around the prince's neck, because I cannot let you go alone. We have lived together, we will be exiled together, and we will die together. Turn me not back if you love me. Consider, the prince answered, what you are doing. All kinds of trial may yet be before me. Why should you leave your home and country to be with me? Because I love you, he said, and shall never be happy without you. So the 2 friends walked along hand in hand as fast as they could to get out of the country, and behind them marched the soldiers and the horses with their valuable burdens. On reaching a place on the borders of the king's dominions, the prince gave the soldiers some gold and ordered them to return. The soldiers took the money and left. They did not, however, go very far, but hid themselves behind rocks and stones, and waited till they were quite sure that the prince did not intend to come back. On and on the exiles walked, till they arrived at a certain village, where they determined to spend the night under one of the big trees of the place. The prince made preparations for a fire, and arranged a few articles of bedding that they had with them, while the vizier's son went to the baniya and the baker and the butcher to get something for their dinner. For some reason he was delayed. Perhaps the soot was not ready, or the baniya had not got all the spices prepared. After waiting half an hour, the prince became impatient and rose up and walked about. He saw a pretty, clear little brook running along not far from their resting place, and hearing that its source was not far distant, he started off to find it. The source was a beautiful lake, which at that time was covered with a magnificent lotus flower and the other water plants. The prince sat down on the bank, and being thirsty took up some of the water in his hand. Fortunately, he looked into his hand before drinking, and there, to his great astonishment, he saw reflected whole and clear the image of a beautiful fairy. He looked around, hoping to see the reality, but seeing no person. He drank the water, and put out his hand to take some more. Again he saw the reflection in the water which was in his palm. He looked around as before, and this time discovered a fairy sitting by the bank on the opposite side of the lake. On seeing her, he fell so madly in love with her that he dropped down in a swoon. When the vizier's son returned and found the fire lighted, the horses securely fastened, and the bags of myrrhs lying together in a heap, but no prince, he did not know what to think. He waited a little while, and then shouted, but not getting any reply, he got up and went to the brook. Then he came across the footmarks of his friend. Seeing these, he went back at once for the money and the horses, bringing them with him. He tracked the prince to the lake, where he found him lying to all appearances dead. "Alas! Alas!" he cried, and lifting up the prince, he poured some water over his head and face. "Alas, my brother, what is this? Oh, do not die and leave me thus. Speak, speak, I cannot bear this." In a few minutes, the prince, revived by the water, opened his eyes and looked about wildly. "Thank God," claimed the vizier's son. "But what is the matter, brother?" "Go away," replied the prince. "I don't want to say anything to you or to see you. Go away." "Come, come, let us leave this place. Look, I have brought some food for you, and horses and everything. Let us eat and depart." "Go alone," replied the prince. "Never," said the vizier's son. "What has happened to suddenly estrange you from me? A little while ago we were brethren, but now you detest the sight of me." "I have looked upon a fairy," said the prince, "but a moment I saw her face. For when she noticed that I was looking at her, she covered her face with lotus petals. Oh, how beautiful she was! And while I gazed, she took out of her bosom an ivory box and held it up to me. Then I fainted. Oh, if you can get me that fairy for my wife, I will go anywhere with you." "Oh, brother," said the vizier's son, "you have indeed seen a fairy. She is a fairy of the fairies. This is none other than Gulizar of the Ivory City. I know this from the signs that she gave you. From her covering her face with lotus petals, I learn her name, and from her showing you the ivory box, I learn where she lives. Be patient, and rest assured that I will arrange your marriage with her." When the prince heard these encouraging words, he felt much comforted, rose up and ate, and then went away gladly with his friend. On the way they met 2 men. These 2 men belonged to the family of robbers. There were 11 of them altogether. One, an elder sister, stayed at home and cooked the food, and the other 10, all brothers, went out 2 and 2 and walked about the 4 different ways that ran through that part of the country, robbing those travellers who could not resist them, and inviting others who were too powerful for 2 of them to manage, to come and rest at their house, where the whole family attacked them and stole their goods. These thieves lived in a kind of tower which had several strong rooms in it, and under it was a great pit wherein they threw the corpses of the poor unfortunates who chanced to fall into their power. The 2 men came forward, and, politely accosting them, begged them to come and stay at their house for the night. "It is late," they said, "and there is not another village within several miles." "Shall we accept this good man's invitation, brother?" asked the prince. The vizier's son frowned slightly in token of disapproval, but the prince was tired, and thinking that it was only a whim of his friends, he said to the men, "Very well, it is very kind of you to ask us." So they all 4 went to the robber's tower. Seated in a room with the great door fastened on the outside, the 2 travellers bemoaned their fate. "It is no good groaning," said the vizier's son. "I will climb the window and see whether there are any means of escape. Yes, yes," he whispered when he reached the window hole. "Below there is a ditch surrounded by a high wall. I will jump down and reconnoitre. You stay here and wait till I return." Presently he came back and told the prince that he had seen a most ugly woman, whom he supposed was the robber's housekeeper. She had agreed to release them on the promise of her marriage with the prince. So the woman led the way out of the enclosure by a secret door. "But where are the horses and the goods?" the vizier's son inquired. "You cannot bring them," the woman said. "To go out by any other way would be to thrust oneself into the grave." "All right then, they also shall go out by this door. I have a charm whereby I can make them thin or fat." So the vizier's son stretched the horses without any person knowing it, and repeating the charm he made them pass through the narrow doorway like pieces of cloth, and when they were all outside restored them to their former condition. He at once mounted his horse and laid hold of the halter of one of the other horses, and then beckoning to the prince to do likewise, he rode off. The prince saw his opportunity, and in a moment was riding after him, having the woman behind him. Now the robbers heard the galloping of the horses, and ran out and shot their arrows at the prince and his companions. And one of these arrows killed the woman, so they had to leave her behind. On and on they rode until they reached the village, where they stayed the night. The following morning they were off again, and asked for Ivory City from every passer-by. At length they came to this famous city, and put up a little hut that belonged to an old woman, from whom they feared no harm, and with whom therefore they could abide in peace and comfort. At first the old woman did not like the idea of these travellers staying in her house, but the sight of a myrrh which the prince dropped in the bottom of a cup in which she had given them water, and a present of another myrrh from the vizier's son, quickly made her change her mind. She agreed to let them stay there for a few days. As soon as her work was over, the old woman came and sat down with her lodgers. The vizier's son pretended to be utterly ignorant of the place and the people. "Has this city a name?" he asked the old woman. "Of course it has, you stupid. Every little village, much more a city, and such a city as this, has a name." "What is the name of this city?" "Ivory City. Don't you know that? I thought the name was known all over the world." On the mention of the name Ivory City, the prince gave a deep sigh. The vizier's son looked as much as to say, "Keep quiet, or you'll discover the secret." "Is there a king in this country?" continued the vizier's son. "Of course there is, and a queen and a princess." "What are their names?" "The name of the princess is Gulizar, and the name of the queen—" The vizier's son interrupted the old woman by turning to look at the prince, who was staring like a madman. "Yes," he said to him afterwards, "we are in the right country. We shall see the beautiful princess." One morning the two travellers noticed the old woman's most careful toilette. How careful she was in the arrangement of her hair and the set of her kasabah and puts. "Who is coming?" said the vizier's son. "Nobody," the old woman replied. "Then where are you going?" "I am going to see my daughter, who is a servant of the Princess Gulizar. I see her and the princess every day. I should have gone yesterday if you had not been here and taken up all my time." "Ah! Be careful not to say anything about us in the hearing of the princess." The vizier's son asked her not to speak about them at the palace, hoping that because she had been told not to do so, she would mention their arrival, and thus the princess would be informed of their coming. On seeing her mother, the girl pretended to be very angry. "Why have you not been for 2 days?" she asked. "Because, my dear," the old woman answered, "two travellers, her prince and the son of some great vizier, have taken up their abode in my hut, and demand so much of my attention. It is nothing but cooking and cleaning and cleaning and cooking all day long. I can't understand the men," she added. "One of them especially appears very stupid. He asked me the name of this country and the name of the king. Now where can these men have come from that they do not know these things? However, they are very great and very rich. They each give me a myrrh every morning and every evening." After this, the old woman went and repeated almost the same words to the princess, on the hearing of which the princess beat her severely, and threatened her with severer punishment if she ever again spoke of the strangers before her. In the evening, when the old woman returned to her hut, she told the vizier's son how sorry she was that she could not help breaking her promise, and how the princess had struck her because she mentioned their coming and all about them. "Alas, alas," said the prince, who had eagerly listened to every word. "What then will be her anger at the sight of a man?" "Anger?" said the vizier's son with an astonished air. "She would be exceedingly glad to see one man. I know this. In this treatment of the old woman, I see her request that you will go and see her during the coming dark fortnight." "Heaven be praised!" the prince exclaimed. The next time the old woman went to the palace, Gulizar called one of her servants and ordered her to rush into the room while she was conversing with the old woman, and if the old woman asked what was the matter, she was to say that the king's elephants had gone mad and were rushing about the city and bazaar in every direction and destroying everything in their way. The servant obeyed, and the old woman, fearing lest the elephant should go and push down her hut and kill the prince and his friend, begged the princess to let her depart. Now Gulizar had obtained a charmed swing that landed whomever sat on it into the place wherever they wished to be. "Get the swing," she said to one of the servants standing by. When it was brought, she bade the old woman to step into it and desire to be at home. The old woman did so, and was at once carried through the air quickly and safely to her hut, where she found her 2 lodgers safe and sound. "Oh," she cried, "I thought both of you would be killed by this time. The royal elephants have got loose and are running about wildly. When I heard this, I was anxious about you, so the princess gave me this charmed swing to return in. But come, let us get outside before the elephants arrive and batter down the place." "Don't believe this," said the vizier's son. "It is a mere hoax. They have been playing tricks with you. You will soon have your heart's desire," he whispered aside to the prince. "These things are signs." 2 days of the dark fortnight had elapsed when the prince and the vizier's son seated themselves in the swing, and wished themselves within the grounds of the palace. In a moment they were there, and there too was the object of their search, standing by one of the palace gates, and longing to see the prince quite as much as he was longing to see her. Oh, what a happy meeting it was! "At last," said Gulizar, "I have seen my beloved, my husband." "1,000 thanks to heaven for bringing you to me," said the prince. Then the prince and Gulizar betrothed themselves to one another, and parted, the one for the hut and the other for the palace, both of them feeling happier than they had ever been before. Henceforth the prince visited Gulizar every day, and returned to the hut every night. One morning Gulizar begged him to stay with her always. She was constantly afraid of some evil happening to him. Perhaps robbers would slay him, or sickness attack him, and then she would be deprived of him. She could not live without seeing him. The prince showed her that there was no real cause for fear, and said that he felt he ought to return to his friend at night, because he had left his home and country and risked his life for him. And moreover, if it had not been for his friend's help, he would never have met with her. Gulizar for this time assented, but she determined in her heart to get rid of the vizier's son as soon as possible. A few days after this conversation, she ordered one of her maids to make a pilau. She gave special directions that a certain poison was to be mixed into it while cooking, and as soon as it was ready, the cover was to be placed on the saucepan so that the poisonous steam might not escape. When the pilau was ready, she sent it at once by the hand of a servant to the vizier's son with a message. "Gulizar the princess sends an offering in the name of her dead uncle." Upon receiving the present, the vizier's son thought that the prince had spoken gratefully of him to the princess, and therefore she had thus remembered him. Accordingly, he sent back his salam and expressions of thankfulness. When it was dinner time, he took the saucepan of pilau and went to eat it by the stream. Taking off the lid, he threw it aside on the grass, then washed his hands. During the minute or so he was performing these ablutions, the green grass under the cover of the saucepan turned quite yellow. He was astonished, and suspecting that there was poison in the pilau, he took a little and threw it to some crows that were hopping about. The moment the crows ate what was thrown to them, they fell down dead. "Heaven be praised!" exclaimed the vizier's son, "who has preserved me from death at this time." On the return of the prince that evening, the vizier's son was very reticent and depressed. The prince noticed this change in him, and asked what was the reason. "Is it because I am away so much at the palace?" The vizier's son saw that the prince had nothing to do with the sending of the pilau, and therefore told him everything. "Look here," he said, "in this handkerchief is some pilau that the princess sent me this morning in the name of her deceased uncle. It is saturated with poison. Thank heaven I discovered it in time." "Oh, brother, who could have done this thing? Who is there that entertains enmity against you?" "The Princess Gulizar." "Listen, the next time you go to see her, I entreat you to take some snow with you, and just before seeing the princess, put a little of it into both your eyes. It will provoke tears, and Gulizar will ask you why you are crying. Tell her that you weep for the loss of your friend who died suddenly this morning. Look, Take too this wine and this shovel. When you have feigned intense grief at the death of your friend, bid the princess to drink a little of the wine. It is strong and will immediately send her into a deep sleep. Then, while she is asleep, heat the shovel and mark her back with it. Remember to bring back the shovel again, and also to take her pearl necklace. This done, return. Now fear not to execute these instructions, because the fulfillment of them depends on your fortune and happiness. I will arrange that your marriage with the princess shall be accepted by the king and all the court." The prince promised that he would do everything the vizier's son had advised him, and he kept his promise. The following night, on the return of the prince from his visit to Galaza, he and the vizier's son, taking the horses and bags of myrrh, went to a graveyard about a mile or so in the distance. It was arranged the vizier's son should act the part of a fakir, and the prince the part of a fakir's disciple and servant. In the morning, when Galaza returned to her senses, she felt a smarting pain in her back, and noticed that her pearl necklace was gone. She went at once and informed the king of the loss of her necklace, but said nothing to him about the pain in her back. The king was very angry when he heard of the theft, and caused proclamation concerning it to be made throughout all the city and surrounding country. "It is well," said the vizier's son when he heard of this proclamation. "Fear not, my brother, but go and take this necklace and try to sell it in the bazaar." The prince took it to a goldsmith and asked him to buy it. "How much do you want for it?" asked the man. 50,000 rupees, the prince replied. "All right," said the man. "Wait here while I go and fetch the money." The prince waited and waited, till at last the goldsmith returned, and with him the kotwal, who at once took the prince into custody on the charge of stealing the princess's necklace. "How did you get the necklace?" the kotwal asked. "A fakir, whose servant I am, gave it to me to sell in the bazaar," the prince replied. "Permit me, and I will show you where he is." The prince directed the kotwal and the policeman to the place where he had left the vizier's son, and there they found the fakir with his eyes shut and engaged in prayer. Presently, when he had finished his devotions, the kotwal asked him to explain how he had obtained possession of the princess's necklace. "Call the king hither," he replied, "and then I will tell his majesty face to face." On this some men went to the king and told him what the fakir had said. His majesty came, and seeing the fakir so solemn and earnest in his devotion, he was afraid to rouse his anger, lest peradventure the displeasure of heaven should descend on him. And so he placed his hands together in the attitude of a supplicant and asked, "How did you get my daughter's necklace?" "Last night," replied the fakir, "we were sitting here by this tomb worshipping Kuda, when a ghoul dressed as a princess came and exhumed a body that had been buried a few days ago and began to eat it. On seeing this, I was filled with anger and beat her back with a shovel which lay on the fire at the time. While running away from me, her necklace got loose and dropped. You wonder at these words, but they are not difficult to prove. Examine your daughter and you will find marks of the burn on her back. Go, and if it is as I say, send the princess to me, and I will punish her." The king went back to the palace and at once ordered the princess's back to be examined. "It is so," said the maidservant. "The burn is there." "Then let the girl be slain immediately," the king shouted. "No, no, your majesty," they replied. "Let us send her to the fakir who discovered this thing, and he may do whatever he wishes with her." The king agreed, and so the princess was taken to the graveyard. "Let her be shut up in a cage and be kept near the grave when she took out the corpse," said the fakir. This was done, and in a little while the fakir and his disciple and the princess were left alone in the graveyard. Night had not long cast its dark mantle over the scene when the fakir and his disciple threw off their disguise, and taking their horses and luggage, appeared before the cage. They released the princess, rubbed some ointment over the scars on her back, and then sat her upon one of their horses behind the prince. Away they rode fast and far, and by the morning were able to rest and talk over their plans in safety. The vizier's son showed the princess some of the poisoned pilau that she had sent him, and asked whether she had repented of her ingratitude. The princess wept and acknowledged that he was her greatest helper and friend. A letter was sent to the chief vizier telling him of all that had happened to the prince and the vizier's son since they had left their country. When the vizier read the letter, he went and informed the king. The king caused a reply to be sent to the two exiles, in which he ordered them not to return, but to send a letter to Gulizar's father and inform him of everything. Accordingly, they did this. The prince wrote a letter at the vizier's son's dictation. On reading the letter, Gulizar's father was much enraged with his viziers and other officials for not discovering the presence in his country of these illustrious visitors, as he was especially anxious to ingratiate himself in the favour of the prince and the vizier's son. He ordered the execution of some of the viziers on a certain date. "Come," he wrote back to the vizier's son, "and stay at the palace, and if the prince desires it, I will arrange for his marriage with Gulizar as soon as possible." The prince and the vizier's son most gladly accepted the invitation, and received a right noble welcome from the king. The marriage soon took place, and then, after a few weeks, the king gave them presents of horses and elephants and jewels and rich cloths, and bade them start for their own land. He was sure that the king would now receive them. The night before they left, the viziers and others, whom the king intended to have executed as soon as his visitors had left, came and besought the vizier's son to plead for them, and promised that they each would give him a daughter in marriage. He agreed to do so, and succeeded in obtaining their pardon. Then the prince, with his beautiful bride Gulizar, and the vizier's son, attended by a troop of soldiers and a large number of camels and horses, bearing very much treasure, left for their own land. In the midst of the way they passed the tower of the robbers, and with the help of the soldiers they razed it to the ground, slew all its inmates, and seized the treasure which they had been amassing there for several years. At length they reached their own country, and when the king saw his son's beautiful wife and his magnificent retinue, he was at once reconciled, and ordered him to enter the city and take up his abode there. Henceforth all was sunshine on the path of the prince. He became a great favourite, and in due time succeeded to the throne, and ruled over the country for many, many years in peace and happiness. End of The Ivory City and its Fairy Princess. From Indian Fairy Tales, selected and edited by Joseph Jacobs. Recording by Annie Mars.
Turning Everything into Gold by Nathaniel Hawthorne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Turning Everything into Gold. Once upon a time, there lived a very rich man, and a king besides, whose name was Midas. And he had a little daughter whom nobody but himself ever heard of, and whose name I either never knew or have entirely forgotten. So, because I love odd names for little girls, I choose to call her Marigold. This King Midas was fonder of gold than of anything else in the world. He valued his royal crown chiefly because it was composed of that precious metal. If he loved anything better or half so well, it was the one little maiden who played so merrily around her father's footstool. But the more Midas loved his daughter, the more did he desire and seek for wealth. He thought, foolish man, that the best thing he could possibly do for this dear child would be to bequeath her the immensest pile of yellow, glistening coin that had ever been heaped together since the world was made. Thus, he gave all his thoughts and all his time to this one purpose. If ever he happened to gaze for an instant at the gold-tinted clouds of the sunset, he wished that they were real gold and that they could be squeezed safely into his strong box. When little Marigold ran to meet him with a bunch of buttercups and dandelions, he used to say, "Po, po, child, if these flowers were as golden as they look, they would be worth the plucking." And yet, in his earlier days, before he was so entirely possessed of this insane desire for riches, King Midas had shown a great taste for flowers. He had planted a garden in which grew the biggest and beautifulest and sweetest roses that any mortal ever saw or smelt. These roses were still growing in the garden, as large, as lovely, and as fragrant as when Midas used to pass whole hours in gazing at them and inhaling their perfume. But now, if he looked at them at all, it was only to calculate how much the garden would be worth if each of the innumerable rose petals were a thin plate of gold. And though he once was fond of music, in spite of an idle story about his ears, which were said to resemble those of an ass, the only music for poor Midas now was the chink of one gold coin against another. At length, as people always grow more and more foolish unless they take care to grow wiser and wiser, Midas had got to be so exceedingly unreasonable that he could scarcely bear to see or touch any object that was not gold. He made it his custom, therefore, to pass a large portion of every day in a dark and dreary apartment underground at the basement of his palace. It was here that he kept his wealth. To this dismal hole, for it was little better than a dungeon, Midas betook himself whenever he wanted to be particularly happy. Here, after carefully locking the door, he would take a bag of gold coins, or a gold cup as big as a washbowl, or a heavy golden bar, or a peck measure of golden dust, and bring them from the obscure corners of the room into the one bright and narrow sunbeam that fell from the dungeon-like window. He valued the sunbeam for no other reason but that his treasure would not shine without its help. And then he would reckon over the coins in the bag, toss up the bar and catch it as it came down, sift the gold dust through his fingers, look at the funny image of his own face as reflected in the burnished circumference of the cup, and whisper to himself, "O Midas, rich King Midas, what a happy man thou art." But it was laughable to see how the image of his face kept grinning at him out of the polished surface of the cup. It seemed to be aware of his foolish behavior and to have a naughty inclination to make fun of him. Midas called himself a happy man, but felt that he was not yet quite so happy as he might be. The very tip-top of enjoyment would never be reached, unless the whole world were to become his treasure room and be filled with yellow metal which should be all as his own. Now, I need hardly remind such wise little people as you are that in the old times, when King Midas was alive, a great many things came to pass which we should consider wonderful if they were to happen in our own day and country. And, on the other hand, a great many things take place nowadays which seem not only wonderful to us, but at which the people of old times would have stared their eyes out. On the whole, I regard our own times as the strangest of the two, but however that may be, I must go on with my story. Midas was enjoying himself in his treasure room one day as usual, when he perceived a shadow fall over the heaps of gold, and, looking suddenly up, what should he behold but the figure of a stranger standing in the bright and narrow sunbeam? It was a young man with a cheerful and ruddy face. Whether it was that the imagination of King Midas threw a yellow tinge over everything, or whatever the cause might be, he could not help fancying that the smile with which the stranger regarded him had a kind of golden radiance in it. Certainly, although his figure intercepted the sunshine, there was now a brighter gleam upon all the piled-up treasures than before. Even the remotest corners had their share of it, and were lighted up when the stranger smiled, as with tips of flame and sparkles of fire. As Midas knew that he had carefully turned the key in the lock, and that no mortal strength could possibly break into his treasure room, he, of course, concluded that his visitor must be something more than mortal. It is no matter about telling you who he was. In those days, when the earth was comparatively a new affair, it was supposed to be often the resort of beings endowed with supernatural power and who used to interest themselves in the joys and sorrows of men, women, and children, half playfully and half seriously. Midas had met such beings before now, and was not sorry to meet one of them again. The stranger's aspect, indeed, was so good-humored and kindly, if not beneficent, that it would have been unreasonable to suspect him of intending any mischief. It was far more probable that he came to do Midas a favor, and what could be that favor, unless to multiply his heaps of treasure? The stranger gazed about the room, and when his lustrous smile had glistened upon all the golden objects that were there, he turned again to Midas. "You're a wealthy man, friend Midas," he observed. "I doubt whether any other four walls on earth contain so much gold as you have contrived to pile up in this room." "I have done pretty well, answered Midas in a discontented tone. "But After all, it is but trifle when you consider that it has taken my whole life to get it together. If one could live 1,000 years, he might have time to go rich." "What?" exclaimed the stranger. "Then you're not satisfied?" Midas shook his head. "And pray what would satisfy you?" asked the stranger. "Merely for the curiosity of the thing. I should be glad to know." Midas paused and meditated. He felt a presentiment that this stranger, with such a golden luster in his good-humored smile, had come hither with both the power and the purpose of gratifying his utmost wishes. Now, therefore, was the fortunate moment, when he had but to speak and obtain whatever possible or seemingly impossible thing it might come into his head to ask. So he thought and thought and thought, and heaped up one golden mountain upon another in his imagination without being able to imagine them big enough. At last a bright idea occurred to King Midas. It seemed really as bright as the glistening metal which he loved so much. Raising his head, he looked the lustrous stranger in the face. "Well, Midas," observed his visitor, "I see that you have at length hit upon something that will satisfy you. Tell me your wish." "It is only this," replied Midas. "I am weary of collecting my treasures with so much trouble and beholding the heap so diminutive after I have done my best. I wish everything that I touch to be changed to gold." The stranger's smile grew so very broad that it seemed to fill the room like an outburst of the sun, gleaming into a shadowy dell where the yellow autumnal leaves, for so looked the lumps and particles of gold, lie strewn in the globe of light. "The golden touch!" exclaimed he. "You certainly deserve credit, friend Midas, for striking out so brilliant a conception. But are you quite sure that this will satisfy you?" "How could it fail?" said Midas. "And will you ever regret the possession of it?" "What could induce me?" asked Midas. "I ask nothing else to render me perfectly happy." "Be it as you wish, then," replied the stranger, waving his hand in token of farewell. "Tomorrow at sunrise you will find yourself gifted with the golden touch." The figure of the stranger then became exceedingly bright, and Midas involuntarily closed his eyes. On opening them again, he beheld only one yellow sunbeam in the room, and all around him the glistening of precious metal which he had spent his life hoarding up. Whether Midas slept as usual that night, the story does not say. Asleep or awake, however, his mind was probably in the state of a child's, to whom a beautiful plaything has been promised in the morning. At any rate, day had hardly peeped over the hills when King Midas was broad awake, and stretching his arms out of bed began to touch the objects that were within reach. He was anxious to prove whether the golden touch had really come according to the stranger's promise. So he laid his finger on a chair by the bedside, and on various other things, but was grievously disappointed to perceive that they remained of exactly the same substance as before. Indeed, he felt very much afraid that he had only dreamed about the lustrous stranger, or else that the latter had been making a game of him. And what a miserable affair would it be if, after all his hopes, Midas must content himself with what little gold he could scrape together by ordinary means instead of creating it by touch. All this while, it was only the gray of the morning, with but a streak of brightness along the edge of the sky, where Midas could not see it. He lay in a very disconsolate mood, regretting the downfall of his hopes, and kept growing sadder and sadder until the earliest sunbeam shone through the window and gilded the ceiling over his head. It seemed to Midas that this bright yellow sunbeam was reflected in a rather singular way on the white covering of the bed. Looking more closely, what was his astonishment and delight when he found that his linen fabric had been transmuted to what seemed a woven texture of the purest and brightest gold. The golden touch had come to him with the first sunbeam. Midas started up in a kind of joyful frenzy and ran about the room, grasping at everything that happened to be in his way. He seized one of the bedposts, and it became immediately a fluted golden pillar. He pulled aside a window curtain in order to admit a clear spectacle of the wonders which he was performing, and the tassel grew heavy in his hand, a mass of gold. He took up a book from the table. At his first touch, it assumed the appearance of such a splendidly bound and gilt-edged volume as one often meets with nowadays. but on running his fingers through the leaves, behold, it was a bundle of thin golden plates in which all the wisdom of the book had grown illegible. He hurriedly put on his clothes and was enraptured to see himself in a magnificent suit of gold cloth, which retained its flexibility and softness, although it burdened him a little with its weight. He drew out his handkerchief, which little Marigold had hemmed for him. That was likewise gold, with the dear child's neat and pretty stitches running all along the border in gold thread. Somehow or other, this last transformation did not quite please King Midas. He would rather that his little daughter's handwork should have remained just the same as when she climbed his knee and put it in his hand. But it was not worth while to vex himself about a trifle. Midas now took his spectacles from his pocket and put them on his nose in order that he might see more distinctly what he was about. In those days, spectacles for common people had not been invented, but were already worn by kings, else how could Midas have had any? To his great perplexity, however, excellent as his glasses were, he discovered that he could not possibly see through them. But this was the most natural thing in the world, for on taking them off, the transparent crystals turned out to be plates of yellow metal, and, of course, were worthless as spectacles, though valuable as gold. It struck Midas as rather inconvenient that, with all his wealth, he could never again be rich enough to own a pair of serviceable spectacles. "It is no great matter, nevertheless," said he to himself, very philosophically. "We cannot expect any great good without its being accompanied with some small inconveniences. The golden touch is worth the sacrifice of a pair of spectacles at least, if not of one's very eyesight. My own eyes will serve for ordinary purposes, and little Marigold will soon be old enough to read to me." Wise King Midas was so exalted by his good fortune that the palace seemed not sufficiently spacious to contain him. He therefore went downstairs and smiled on observing that the balustrade of the staircase became a bar of burnished gold as his hand passed over it in his descent. He lifted the door latch. It was brass only a moment ago, but golden when his fingers quitted it, and emerged into the garden. Here, as it happened, he found a great number of beautiful roses in full bloom, and others in all the stages of lovely bud and blossom. Very delicious was their fragrance in the morning breeze. Their delicate blush was one of the fairest sights in the world. So gentle, so modest, and so full of sweet tranquility did these roses seem to be. But Midas knew a way to make them far more precious, according to his way of thinking, than the roses had ever been before. So he took great pains in going from bush to bush and exercising his magic touch most indefatigably until every individual flower and bud, and even the worms at the heart of some of them, were changed to gold. By the time this good work was completed, King Midas was summoned to breakfast, and as the morning air had given him an excellent appetite, he made haste back to the palace. What was usually a king's breakfast in the days of Midas, I really do not know, and cannot stop now to investigate. To the best of my belief, however, on this particular morning, the breakfast consisted of hot cakes, some nice little brook trout, roasted potatoes, fresh boiled eggs, and coffee for King Midas himself, and a bowl of bread and milk for his daughter Marigold. At all events, this is a breakfast fit to set before a king, and whether he had it or not, King Midas could not have had a better. Little Marigold had not yet made her appearance. Her father ordered her to be called, and seating himself at the table, awaited the child's coming in order to begin his own breakfast. To do Midas justice, he really loved his daughter, and loved her so much the more this morning on account of the good fortune which had befallen him. It was not a great while before he heard her coming along the passageway, crying bitterly. This circumstance surprised him because Marigold was one of the cheerfulest little people whom you would see in a summer's day, and hardly shed a thimbleful of tears in a 12-month. When Midas heard her sobs, he determined to put little Marigold into better spirits by an agreeable surprise. So, leaning across the table, he touched his daughter's bowl, which was a china one with pretty little figures all around it, and transmuted it into gleaming gold. Meanwhile, Marigold slowly and disconsolately opened the door and showed herself with her apron at her eyes, still sobbing as if her heart would break. "How now, my little lady?" cried Midas. "Pray, what is the matter with you this bright morning?" Marigold, without taking the apron from her eyes, held out her hand, in which was one of the roses which Midas had so recently transmuted. "Beautiful!" exclaimed her father. "And what is there in this magnificent golden rose to make you cry?" "Ah, dear father," answered the child, as well as her sobs would let her, "it is not beautiful, but the ugliest flower that ever grew. As soon as I was dressed, I ran into the garden to gather some roses for you, because I know you like them, and and like them the better when gathered by your little daughter, but oh dear, dear me. What do you think has happened? Such a misfortune. All the beautiful roses that smelled so sweetly and had so many lovely blushes are blighted and spoiled. They're grown quite yellow, as you see this one, and have no longer any fragrance. What can have been the matter with them?
"Oh, my little girl,
Pray don't cry about it," said Midas, who was ashamed to confess that he himself had wrought the change which so greatly afflicted her.
sit down and eat your bread and milk.
You will find it easy enough to exchange a golden rose like that, which will last hundreds of years, for an ordinary one which would wither in a day."
I don't care for such roses as this,
cried Marigold, tossing it contemptuously away.
"It has no smell, and the hard petals prick my nose."
The child now sat down to table, but was so occupied with her grief for the blighted roses that she did not even notice the wonderful transmutation of her china bowl. Perhaps this was all the better, for Marigold was accustomed to take pleasure in looking at the queer figures and strange trees and houses that were painted on the circumference of the bowl, and these ornaments were now entirely lost in the yellow hue of the metal. Midas, meanwhile, had poured out a cup of coffee, and, as a matter of course, the coffee pot, whatever metal it may have been when he took it up, was gold when he set it down. He thought to himself that it was rather an extravagant style of splendor in a king of his simple habits to breakfast off a service of gold, and began to be puzzled with the difficulty of keeping his treasures safe. The cupboard and kitchen would no longer be a secure place of deposit for articles so valuable as golden bowls and coffee pots. Amid these thoughts, he lifted a spoonful of coffee to his lips and, sipping it, was astonished to perceive that the instant his lips touched the liquid, it became molten gold and the next moment hardened into a lump. "Ah!" exclaimed Midas, rather aghast. "What is the matter, father?" asked little Marigold, gazing at him with a tear still standing in her eyes. "Nothing, child, nothing," said Midas. "Eat your milk before it gets quite cold." He took one of the nice little trouts on his plate and, by way of an experiment, touched its tail with his finger. To his horror, it was immediately transmuted from an admirably fried brook trout into a gold fish, though not one of those gold fishes which people keep in glass globes as ornaments for the parlor. No, but it was really a metallic fish and looked as if it had been cunningly made by the nicest goldsmith in the world. Its little bones were now golden wires, its fins and tails were thin plates of gold, and there were the marks of the fork in it, and all the delicate, frothy appearance of a nicely fried fish exactly imitated in metal. A very pretty piece of work, as you may suppose, only King Midas just at that moment would much rather have had a real trout in his dish than this elaborate and valuable imitation of one.
I don't quite see, thought he to himself, how I am to get any breakfast.
He took one of the smoking hot cakes, and had scarcely broken into it when, to his cruel mortification, though a moment before it had been the whitest wheat, it assumed the yellow hue of Indian meal. To say the truth, if it had really been a hot Indian cake, Midas would have prized it a good deal more than he did now, when its solidity and increased weight made him too bitterly sensible that it was gold. Almost in despair, he helped himself to a boiled egg, which immediately underwent a change similar to those of the trout and the cake. The egg, indeed, might have been mistaken for one of those which the famous goose in the storybook was in the habit of laying, but King Midas was the only goose that had had anything to do with the matter.
Well, this is a quandary,
thought he, leaning back in his chair and looking quite enviously at little Marigold, who was now eating her bread and milk with great satisfaction.
Such a costly breakfast before me, and nothing can be eaten.
Hoping that, by dint of great dispatch, he might avoid what he now felt to be a considerable inconvenience, King Midas next snatched a hot potato and attempted to cram it into his mouth and swallow it in a hurry. But the golden touch was too nimble for him. He found his mouth full, not of a mealy potato, but of solid metal, which so burnt his tongue that he roared aloud, and jumping up from the table began to dance and stamp about the room, both with pain and affright.
"Father, dear father!"
cried little Marigold, who was a very affectionate child.
"Pray, what is the matter? Have you burnt your mouth?" "Oh, dear child,"
groaned Midas dolefully.
"I don't know what is to become of your poor father."
And truly, my dear little folks, did you ever hear of such a pitiable case in all your lives? Here was literally the richest breakfast that could be set before a king, and its very richness made it absolutely good for nothing. The poorest laborer, sitting down to his crust of bread and cup of water, was far better off than King Midas, whose delicate food was really worth its weight in gold. And what was to be done? Already at breakfast, Midas was excessively hungry. Would he be less so by dinner time? And how ravenous would be his appetite for supper, which must undoubtedly consist of the same sort of indigestible dishes as those now before him? How many days, think you, would he survive a continuance of this rich fare? These reflections so troubled wise King Midas that he began to doubt whether, after all, riches are the one desirable thing in the world, or even the most desirable. But this was only a passing thought. So fascinated was Midas with the glitter of the yellow metal that he would still have refused to give up the golden touch for so paltry a consideration as a breakfast. It would have been the same as paying millions and millions of money, and as many millions more as would have taken forever to reckon up, for some fried trout, an egg, a potato, a hot cake, and a cup of coffee. Thought King Midas. Nevertheless, so great was his hunger and the perplexity of his situation that he again groaned aloud, and very grievously too. Our pretty Marigold couldn't endure it no longer. She sat a moment, gazing at her father and trying with all the might of her little wits to find out what was the matter with him. Then, with a sweet and sorrowful impulse to comfort him, she started from her chair and, running to Midas, threw her arms affectionately about his knees. He bent down and kissed her. He felt that his little daughter's love was worth 1,000 times more than he had gained by the golden touch.
My precious, precious Marigold!
Cried he, but Marigold made no answer. Alas, what had he done? How fatal was the gift which the stranger bestowed! The moments the lips of Midas touched Marigold's forehead, a change had taken place. Her sweet, rosy face, so full of affection as it had been, assumed a glittering yellow color with yellow teardrops congealed on her cheeks. Her beautiful brown ringlets took the same tint. Her soft and tender little form grew hard and inflexible within her father's encircling arms. Oh, terrible misfortune! The victim of his insatiable desire for wealth, little Marigold was a human child no longer, but a golden statue. Yes, there she was, with the questioning look of love, grief, and pity hardened in her face. It was the prettiest and most woeful sight that ever mortal saw. All the features and tokens of Marigold were there. Even the beloved little dimple remained in her golden chin. But the more perfect was the resemblance, the greater was the father's agony at beholding this golden image, which was all that was left him of a daughter. It had been a favorite phrase of Midas, whenever he felt particularly fond of the child, to say that she was worth her weight in gold. And now the phrase had become literally true. And now, at last, when it was too late, he felt how infinitely a warm and tender heart that loved him exceeded in value all the wealth that could be piled up betwixt the earth and sky. It would be too sad a story if I were to tell you how Midas, in the fullness of his gratified desires, began to wring his hands and bemoan himself, and how he could neither bear to look at Marigold nor yet to look away from her, except when his eyes were fixed on the image. He could not possibly believe that she was changed to gold. But, stealing another glance, there was the precious little figure, with a yellow teardrop on its yellow cheek and a look so piteous and tender that it seemed as if the very expression must needs soften the gold and make it flesh again. This, however, could not be, so Midas had only to wring his hands and to wish that he were the poorest man in the wide world if the loss of all his wealth might bring back the faintest rose color to his dear child's face. While he was in this tumult of despair, he suddenly beheld a stranger standing near the door. Midas bent down his head without speaking, for he recognized the same figure which had appeared to him the day before in the treasure room and had bestowed on him this disastrous faculty of the golden touch. His countenance still wore a smile, which seemed to shed a yellow luster all about the room and gleamed on little Marigold's image and on the other objects that had been transmuted by the touch of Midas. "Well, friend Midas," said the stranger, "pray how do you succeed with the golden touch?" Midas shook his head. "I'm very miserable," said he. "Very miserable indeed," exclaimed the stranger. "And how happens that?"
Have I not faithfully kept my promise to you? Have you not everything that your heart desired? Gold is not everything, answered Midas, and I have lost all that my heart really cared for. Ah, so you have made a discovery since yesterday, observed the stranger. Let us see then. Which of these two things do you think is really worth the most? The gift of the golden touch, or 1 cup of clear, cold water? Oh, blessed water! Exclaimed Midas. It will never moisten my parched throat again. The golden touch, continued the stranger, or a crust of bread? A piece of bread, answered Midas. Is it worth all the gold on earth? The golden touch, asked the stranger, or your own little marigold? Warm, soft, and loving as she was an hour ago. Oh, my dear child, cried poor Midas, wringing his hands. I would not have given that one small dimple on her chin for the power of changing this whole big earth into a solid lump of gold. You are wiser than you were, King Midas, said the stranger, looking seriously at him. Your own heart, I perceive, has not entirely changed from flesh to gold. Were it so, your case would indeed be desperate. But you appear to still be capable of understanding that the commonest things, such as a lie within everybody's grasp, are more valuable than the riches which so many mortals sigh and struggle after. Tell me, now, do you sincerely desire to rid yourself of this golden touch? It is hateful to me, replied Midas. A fly settled on his nose, but immediately fell to the floor, for it, too, had become gold. Midas shuddered. Go, then, said the stranger, and plunge into the river that glides past the bottom of your garden. Take likewise a vase of the same water, and sprinkle it over any object that you may desire to change back again from gold into its former substance. If you do this, in earnestness and sincerity, it may possibly repair the mischief which your avarice has occasioned. King Midas bowed low, and when he lifted his head, the lustrous stranger had vanished. You will easily believe that Midas lost no time in snatching up a great earthen pitcher, but alas me, it was no longer earthen after he touched it, and hastening to the riverside. As he scampered along and forced his way through the shrubbery, it was positively marvelous to see how the foliage turned yellow behind him, as if the autumn had been there and nowhere else. On reaching the river's brink, he plunged headlong in, without waiting so much as to pull off his shoes. Snorted King Midas, as his head emerged out of the water. Well, this is a really refreshing bath, and I think it must have quite washed away the golden touch. And now for filling my pitcher. As he dipped the pitcher into the water, it gladdened his very heart to see it change from gold into the same good, honest earthen vessel which it had been before he touched it. He was conscious also of a change within himself. A cold, hard, and heavy weight seemed to have gone out of his bosom. No doubt, his heart had been gradually losing its human substance and transmuting itself into insensible metal, but had now softened back again into flesh. Perceiving a violet that grew on the bank of the river, Midas touched it with his finger, and was overjoyed to find that the delicate flower retained its purple hue, instead of undergoing a yellow blight. The curse of the golden touch had therefore really been removed from him. King Midas hastened back to the palace, and I suppose the servants knew not what to make of it when they saw their royal master so carefully bringing home an earthen pitcher of water. But that water, which was to undo all the mischief that his folly had wrought, was more precious to Midas than an ocean of molten gold could have been. The first thing he did, as you need hardly be told, was to sprinkle it by handfuls over the golden figure of little Marigold. No sooner did it fall on her that you would have laughed to see how the rosy color came back to the dear child's cheek, and how she began to sneeze and sputter, and how astonished she was to find herself dripping wet, and her father still throwing more water over her. "Pray do not, dear father," cried she. "See how you have wet my nice frock, which I put on only this morning." For Marigold did not know that she had been a little golden statue, nor could she remember anything that had happened since the moment when she ran with outstretched arms to comfort poor King Midas. Her father did not think it necessary to tell his beloved child how very foolish he had been, but contented himself with showing how much wiser he had now grown.
For this purpose he led little Marigold into the garden, where he sprinkled all the remainder of the water over the rose bushes, and with such good effect that above 5,000 roses recovered their beautiful bloom. There were 2 circumstances, however, which, as long as he lived, used to put King Midas in mind of the golden touch. One was that the sands of the river sparkled like gold. The other, that little Marigold's hair had now a golden tinge, which he had never observed in it before she had been transmuted by the effect of his kiss. This change of hue was really an improvement and made Marigold's hair richer than in her babyhood. When King Midas had grown quite an old man and used to trot Marigold's children on his knee, he was fond of telling them this marvelous story, pretty much as I have told it to you. And then would he stroke their glossy ringlets and tell them that their hair likewise had a rich shade of gold, which they had inherited from their mother. And to tell you the truth, my precious little folks, quoth King Midas, diligently trotting the children all the while, ever since that morning I have hated the very sight of all other gold, save this.
End of Turning Everything into Gold by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Recorded by Nathan McDonald.
Well o' the World's End of the Scottish Fairy Book by Elizabeth W. Grierson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lewis West. There once was an old widow woman who lived in a little cottage with her only daughter, who was such a bonny lassie that everyone liked to look at her. One day the old woman took a notion into her head to bake a girdle full of cakes, so she took down her bakeboard and went to the girl and fetched a basin full of meal. But when she went to seek a jug of water to mix the meal with, she found that there was none in the house. So she called to her daughter who was in the garden, and when the girl came, she held out the empty jug to her, saying, "Run, like a good lassie, to the well o' the world's end, and bring me a jug of water, for I have long found that water from the well o' the world's end makes the best cakes." So the lassie took the jug and set out on her errand. Now, as its name shows, it is a long road to that well, and many a weary mile had the poor maid to go ere she reached it. But she arrived there at last, and what was her disappointment to find it dry. She was so tired and so vexed that she sat down beside it and began to cry, for she did not know where to get any more water, and she felt that she could not go back to her mother with an empty jug. While she was crying, a nice yellow paddock with very bright eyes came jumping over the stones of the well and squatted down at her feet, looking up into her face. "And why are ye grieving, my bonny maid?" he asked. "Is there aught that I can do to help thee?" "I am grieving because the well is empty," she answered, "and I cannot get any water to carry home to my mother." "Listen," said the paddock softly, "I can get thee water in plenty, if so be thou wilt promise to be my wife." Now the lassie had but one thought in her head, and that was to get the water for her mother's oatcakes, and she never for a moment thought that the paddock was in earnest, so she promised gladly enough to be his wife if he would get her a jug of water. No sooner had the words passed her lips than the beastie jumped down the mouth of the well, and in another moment it was full to the brim with water. The lassie filled her jug and carried it home without troubling any more about the matter. But late that night, just as her mother and she were going to bed, something came with a faint thud, thud against the cottage door, and then they heard a tiny little wee voice singing, "Oh, open the door, my hinny, my heart. Oh, open the door, my ain true love. Remember the promise that you and I made down in the meadow where we two met." "Wheesht," said the old woman, raising her head. "What noise is that at the door?" "Oh," said her daughter, who was feeling rather frightened, "it's only a yellow paddock." "Poor bit beastie," said the kind-hearted old mother. "Open the door and let him in. It's cold work sitting on the doorstep." So the lassie very unwillingly opened the door, and the paddock came jumping across the kitchen and sat down at the fireside. And while he sat there, he began to sing this song. "Oh, gi'e me my supper, my hinny, my heart. Oh, gi'e me my supper, my ain true love. Remember the promise that you and I made down in the meadow where we two met." "Gi'e the poor beast his supper," said the old woman. "He's an uncommon paddock that can sing like that." "Tut," replied her daughter crossly, for she was growing more and more frightened as she saw the creature's bright black eyes fixed on her face. "I'm not going to be so silly as to feed a wet, sticky paddock." "Don't be ill-natured and cruel," said her mother. "Who knows how far the little beastie has traveled, and I warrant that it would like a saucer full of milk." Now the lassie could have told her that the paddock had traveled from the Well o' the World's End, but she held her tongue, and went ben to the milk house and brought back a saucer full of milk, which she sat down before the strange little visitor. "Now chop off my head, my hinny, my heart. Now chop off my head, my ain true love. Remember the promise that you and I made down in the meadow where we two met." "Hout! Havers! Pay no heed, the creature's daft!" exclaimed the old woman, running forward to stop her daughter, who was raising the axe to chop off the paddock's head. But she was too late. Down came the axe, off went the head. And lo and behold, on the spot where the little creature had sat, stood the handsomest young prince that had ever been seen. He wore such a noble air, and was so richly dressed, that the astonished girl and her mother would have fallen on their knees before him, had he not prevented them by a movement of his hand. "'Tis I that should kneel to thee, sweetheart," he said, turning to the blushing girl. "For thou hast delivered me from a fearful spell which was cast over me in my infancy by a wicked fairy, who at the same time slew my father. For long years I have lived in that well, the Well of the World's End, waiting for a maiden to appear who should take pity on me, even in my loathsome disguise, and promise to be my wife, and who would also have the kindness to let me into her house, and the courage, at my bidding, to cut off my head. Now I can return and claim my father's kingdom, and thou, most gracious maiden, will go with me and be my bride, for thou well deservest the honor." And this was how the lassie who went to fetch water from the Well of the World's End became a princess. End of The Well of the World's End, recorded by Lewis West.
Ulysses and the Cyclops by Sir George W. Cox. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ulysses and the Cyclops. When the blue hills of the Lotus Land had faded away in the far distance, the ships of Ulysses went on merrily with a fresh breeze, and the men thought that they would soon come to rocky Ithaca, where their homes were. But Minerva was angry with Ulysses, and she asked Neptune, Lord of the Sea, to send a great storm and scatter his ships. So the wind arose, and the waters of the sea began to heave and swell, and the sky was black with clouds and rain. Many days and many nights the storm raged fiercely, and when it was over, Ulysses could only see 4 or 5 of all the ships which had sailed with him from Troy. The ships were drenched with the waves which had broken over them, and the men were wet and cold and tired, and they were glad indeed when they saw an island far away. So they sat down on the benches and took the great oars and rowed the ships towards the shore. And as they came near, they saw that the island was very beautiful, with cliffs and rocks and bays for ships to take shelter from the sea. They rowed into one of these quiet bays where the water was always calm, and where there was no need to let down an anchor or to tie the ship by ropes to the seashore, for the ship lay there quite still of itself. At the head of the bay, a stream of fresh water trickled down from the cliffs and ran close to the opening of a large cave. And near the cave some willow trees drooped their branches over the stream which ran down towards the sea. So they made haste to go on shore, and when they had landed, they saw fine large plains on which corn might grow. But no one had taken the trouble to sow the seed, and sloping hills for the grapes to ripen on the vines, but none were planted on them. Ulysses marveled at the people who lived there, because they had no corn and no vines, and he could see no houses, but only sheep and goats feeding on the hillsides. So he took his bows and arrows and shot many of the goats, and he and his men lay down on the ground and had a merry meal. When they had finished, they fell asleep, and did not wake till morning showed its rosy light in the eastern sky. Then Ulysses said that he would take some of his men and go to see who lived on the island, while the others remained in the ship close to the seashore. So they set out, and at last they came to the mouth of a great cave where many sheep and goats were penned up in large folds. They could see no one in the cave or anywhere near it, and they waited a long while, but no one came. They lit a fire and made themselves merry as they ate the cheese and drank the milk which was stored up round the sides of the cave. Suddenly, they heard a great noise of heavy feet stamping on the ground. They were so frightened that they ran inside the cave and crouched down at the end of it. Nearer and nearer came the Cyclops, as his tread almost made the earth shake. In he came, with many dry logs of wood on his back, and in came all the sheep which he milked every evening, but the rams and the goats stayed outside. But if Ulysses and his men were afraid when they saw Polyphemus, the Cyclops, come in, they were much more afraid when he took up a great stone, which was almost as big as the mouth of the cave, and set it up against it for a door. Then the men whispered to Ulysses and said, "Did we not beg and pray you not to come into the cave? But you would not listen to us, and now how are we to get out again? Why, 22 wagons would not be able to take away that huge stone from the mouth of the cave." They were shut in now, and there was no use in thinking of their folly for coming in. So there they lay, crouching in the corner of the cave and trembling with fear lest Polyphemus should see them. But the Cyclops went on milking the sheep. Then he put the milk into the bowls round the sides of the cave and lit the fire to cook his meal. As the flames shot up from the burning wood to the roof of the cave, it showed him the forms of Ulysses and his companions, where they lay huddled together in the corner. He cried out to them with a loud voice, "Who are you that dare come into the cave of Polyphemus? Are you to come rob me of my sheep, or my cheese and milk that I keep here?" Then Ulysses said, "No, we are not come to do you harm. We are Greeks, who have been fighting at Troy to bring back Helen, whom Paris stole away from Sparta, and we went there with the great king Agamemnon, whom everybody knows. We are on our way home to Ithaca, but Neptune sent a great storm because Minerva was angry with me, and almost all our ships have been sunk in the sea or broken to pieces on the rocks." When he had finished speaking, Polyphemus frowned savagely and said, "I know nothing of Agamemnon, or Paris or Helen." And he seized 2 of the men and broke their heads against the stones and cooked them for his dinner. That day, Polyphemus ate a huge meal and drank several bowls full of milk, and after that he fell fast asleep. As he lay there, snoring in his heavy sleep, Ulysses thought how easy it would be to plunge the sword into his breast and kill him. He was just going to do it when he thought of the great stone which Polyphemus had placed at the mouth of the cave, and he knew that if Polyphemus were killed, no one else could move away the stone, and so they would all die shut up in that dismal place. So the hours of the night went wearily on. Neither Ulysses nor his friends could sleep, for they thought of the men whom Polyphemus had eaten and how they would very likely be eaten up themselves. At last, they could tell from the dim light which came in between the top of the stone and the roof of the cave that the morning was come. Soon Polyphemus awoke and milked all the sheep again. When he had done this, he went to the end of the cave and took up 2 more men and killed and ate them. Then he took down the great stone from the mouth of the cave and drove all the cattle out to graze on the soft grass on the hills. And Ulysses began to hope that they might be able to get away before Polyphemus came back. But the Cyclops was not so silly as to let them go, for as soon as the cattle were gone out, he took up the huge stone again as easily as if it had been a pebble and put it up against the mouth of the cave. And there were Ulysses and his friends, shut up again as fast as ever. Then Ulysses began to think more and more how they were to get away, for if they stayed there, they would soon be all killed if Polyphemus went on eating 4 of them every day. At least, near the sheepfold, he saw a club which Polyphemus was going to use as a walking stick. It was the whole trunk of an olive tree, fresh and green, for he had only just cut it and left it to dry, that he might carry it about when it was fit for use. There it lay like the mast of a ship, which 20 men could hardly have lifted. Ulysses cut off a bit from the end, as much as a man could carry, and told the men to bring it to a very sharp point. And when they had done this, he hardened it in the fire, and then hid it away till Polyphemus should come home. By and by, when the sun was sinking, they heard the terrible tramp of his feet, and felt the earth shake beneath his tread. The great stone was taken away from the mouth of the cave, and in he came, driving the sheep and goats, and the rams also before him, for this time he let nothing stay outside. He milked the sheep and the goats, as he had done the day before, and then he killed 2 more men, and began to eat them for his supper. Then Ulysses went towards him with a bottle full of wine and said, "Drink this wine, Polyphemus. It will make your supper taste much nicer. I have brought it to you because I want you to do me some kindness in return." So the Cyclops stretched out his hand to take the wine, and he drank it off greedily and asked for more.
"Give me more of this honey-sweet wine," he said. "Surely no grapes on this earth could ever give such a wine as this. Tell me your name, for I should like to do you a kindness for giving me such a wine as this."
Then Ulysses said, "Oh, Cyclops, I hope you will not forget to give me what you have promised. My name is Nobody." And Polyphemus said,
"Very well. I shall eat up Nobody last of all when I have eaten up all his companions. And this is the kindness which I mean to do for him."
By this time he was so stupid with all he had been eating and drinking that he could say no more, but fell on his back fast asleep, and his heavy snoring sounded through the whole of the cave. Then Ulysses cried to his friends, "Now is the time! Come and help me. We will punish this Cyclops for all that he has done." So he took the piece of the olive tree, which had been made sharp, and put it into the fire till it almost burnt into a flame. And he and 2 of his men went and stood over Polyphemus and pushed the burning wood into his great eye as hard and as far down as they could. It was a terrible sight to see, but the Cyclops was so stupid and heavy in sleep that at first he could scarcely stir. Presently he gave a great groan, so that Ulysses and his people started back in fright and crouched down at the end of the cave. And then the Cyclops put out his hand, drew the burning wood from his eye, and threw it from him in a rage, and roared out for help to his friends who lived on the hills round about. His roar was as deep and loud as the roar of 20 lions. And the other Cyclopes wondered when they heard him shouting out so loud, and they said, "What can be the matter with Polyphemus? We never heard him make such a noise before. Let us go and see if he wants any help." So they went to the cave and stood outside the great stone which shut it in, listening to his terrible bellowings, and when they did not stop, they shouted to him and asked him what was the matter.
"Why have you waked us up in the middle of the night with all this noise when we were sleeping comfortably? Is anyone taking away your sheep and goats, or killing you by craft and force?"
And Polyphemus said,
"Nobody, my friends, is killing me by craft and force."
When the others heard this, they were angry and said,
"Well then, if nobody's killing you, why do you roar so? If you are ill, you must bear it as best as you can, and ask our father Neptune to make you well again."
And then they walked off to their beds and left Polyphemus to make as much noise as he pleased. It was no use that he went on shouting. No one came to him any more, and Ulysses laughed because he had tricked him so cunningly by calling himself Nobody. Polyphemus got up at last, moaning and groaning with the dreadful pain, and groped his way with his hands against the sides of the cave until he came to the door. Then he took down the great stone and sat with his arms stretched out wide, and he said to himself,
"Now I shall be sure to catch them, for no one can get out without passing me."
But Ulysses was too clever for him yet, for he went quietly and fastened the great rams of Polyphemus together with long bands of willow. He tied them together by 3s, and under the stomach of the middle one he tied one of his men, until he had fastened them all up safely. Then he went and caught hold of the largest ram of all, and clung on with his hands to the thick wool underneath his stomach. And so they waited, in a great fright lest after all the giant might catch them and kill them. At last the pale light of the morning came into the eastern sky, and very soon the sheep and the goats began to go out of the cave. Polyphemus passed his hands over the backs of all the sheep as they went by, but he did not feel the willow bands, because their wool was long and thick, and he never thought that anyone would be tied up underneath their stomachs. Last of all came the great ram to which Ulysses was clinging. When Polyphemus passed his hand over his back, he stroked him gently and said,
"Is there something the matter with you too, as there is with your master? You were always the first to go out of the cave, and now today for the first time you are the last. I am sure that horrible Nobody is at the bottom of all of this. Ah, old ram, perhaps it is that you are sorry for your master whose eye Nobody has put out. I wish you could speak like a man and tell me where he is. If I could but catch him, I would take care that he never got away again, and then I should have some comfort for all the evil which Nobody has done to me."
So he sent the ram on, and when he had gone a little way from the cave, Ulysses got up from under the ram and went and untied all his friends, and very glad they were to be free once more, although they could not help grieving when they thought of the men whom Polyphemus had killed. But Ulysses told them to make haste and drive as many of the sheep and goats as they could to the ships. So they drove them down to the shore and hurried them into the ships and began to row away, and soon they would have been out of reach of the Cyclops if Ulysses could only have held his tongue. He was so angry himself that he thought he would like to make Polyphemus still more angry. So he shouted to him,
Cruel Cyclops, did you think that you would not be punished for eating up my friends? Is this the way in which you receive strangers who have been tossed about by many storms upon the sea?
Then Polyphemus was more furious than ever, and he broke off a great rock from the mountain and hurled it at Ulysses. On it came whizzing through the air and fell just in front of his ship, and the water was dashed up all over it, and there was a great heaving of the sea which almost carried them back to the land. They began to row again with all their might, but still, when they had got about twice as far as they were before, Ulysses could not help shouting out a few more words to Polyphemus. So he said,
If anyone asks you how you lost your eye, remember, mighty Cyclops, to say that you were made blind by Ulysses, the plunderer of cities, the son of Laertes, who lives in Ithaca.
Terrible indeed was the fury of Polyphemus when he heard this, and he said,
Now I remember how the wise Telemus used to tell me that a man would come here named Ulysses, who would put my eye out, but I thought he would have been some great strong man almost as big as myself, and this is a miserable little wretch whom I could almost hold in my hand if I caught him. But stay, and I will show you how I thank you for your kindness. And I will ask my father Neptune to send you a pleasant storm to toss you upon the dark sea.
Then Polyphemus took up a bigger rock than ever and hurled it high into the air with all his might, but this time it fell just behind the ship of Ulysses. Up rose the water and drenched Ulysses and all his people and almost sank the ship under the sea, but it only sent them further out of the reach of the Cyclops. And then he hurled more rocks after them. They now fell far behind in the sea and did them no harm. Even when they had rowed a long way, they could still see Polyphemus standing on the high cliff and shaking his hands at them in rage and pain. But no one came to help him for all his shouting, because he had told his friends that nobody was doing him harm. End of Ulysses and the Cyclops by Sir George W. Cox. Recorded by Nathan McDonald.
Mighty Mikko, a book of Finnish fairy tales and folk tales by Parker Fillmore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mighty Mikko, a book of Finnish fairy tales and folk tales. The Mysterious Servant, the story of a young man who respected the dead. There was once a rich merchant who had an only son. As he lay dying, he said,
Maddie, my boy, my end is approaching, and there are two things I want to say to you. The first is that I am leaving you all my wealth. If you are careful, you will have enough to suffice you for life. The second thing I have to say is to beg you never to leave this, your native village. At your birth, there was a prophecy which declared that if ever you left this village, you would have to marry a woman with horns. Now that I have warned you in time, it will be your own fault if ever you have to meet this fate.
The merchant died, and Maddie was left alone. He had never before wanted to travel, but now that he knew of the fate which would overtake him if he did, he couldn't bear the thought of remaining forever a prisoner in his native village. What's the use of riches, he asked himself, if one can't travel over the broad world and see wonderful sights? Besides, if it's my fate to marry a horned woman, I don't see why sitting quietly at home is going to save me. No, I'm going to take my chances like a man and come and go as I like." So he gathered his riches together, closed the old house where he had been born, and started out into the bright world. He traveled many days, meeting strange peoples and seeing strange sights. At last, he settled down in a large city and became a merchant like his father. One afternoon, as he was walking, he saw a crowd of men dragging the body of a dead man in the gutter. They were kicking and abusing the dead body and calling it evil names. Maddie stopped them. "What is this you're doing?" he demanded. "Don't you know that disrespect to the dead is disrespect to God? Give over abusing this poor dead body and bury it decently, or God will punish you." "Let us alone," the men cried. "He deserves the abuse we're giving him. When he was alive, he borrowed money from us, and then he died without repaying us. Are we to have no satisfaction at all?" With that, they resumed their abuse of the dead body. "Wait," Maddie cried. "Tell me what the dead man owed you, and I will pay it." "He owed me 10 ducats, said one. "And me 100, shouted another. "And me 500, and me 1,000. "Come, all of you to my house," Maddie said, "and I will pay you, but only on condition that first you hand over the body to me and help me give it a decent burial." The men agreed. They helped Maddie bury the dead man, and then went home with him. Each told Maddie the amount the dead man owed him, and, true to his promise, Maddie paid them all. When he had paid the last man, he found he had nothing left for himself but 9 silver kopecks. The man's debts had exhausted all the wealth his father had left him. "No matter," Maddie thought to himself. "My riches would have done me no good if I had stood by and allowed a poor dead man to be abused. What if I have nothing left? I'm young and strong, and I can go out into the world and make my livelihood somehow. I'll go home and have one last look at my native village, and then life begins anew." So, dressed in shabby old clothes with nothing in his pockets but the 9 silver kopecks, Maddie left the city where people were beginning to know him as a merchant and started back to his native village. He was soon met by a man who addressed him respectfully and asked to be engaged as his servant. "My servant," Maddie replied with a laugh. "My dear fellow, I'm too poor to have a servant. All I have in the world are 9 silver kopecks." "No matter, master," the man said. "Take me anyhow. I will serve you well, and I promise you will not regret our bargain." So Maddie agreed, and they walked on together. The sun was hot, and by mid-afternoon, Maddie was feeling faint with hunger and fatigue. "Master," the servant said, "I will run ahead to the next village and order the landlord at the inn to prepare you a fine dinner. Do you come along slowly, and by the time you arrive, dinner will be ready." "But remember," Maddie warned him, "I have no money to pay for a fine dinner." "Trust me," the servant said, and off he hurried. At the next village, he hunted out the best inn and ordered the landlord to prepare his finest dinner without delay. He was so particular that everything should be the best that the landlord supposed his master must be some great lord. When Maddie arrived on foot, tired and travel-stained and shabby, the landlord was amazed. "It's fine lords we have nowadays," he muttered scornfully, and he wished he had not been in such haste to cook the best food in the house. But it was cooked and ready to serve, so, with an ill grace, he served it. Maddie and his man ate their fill of good cabbage soup and fish and fowl, tender and juicy. It quite enraged the landlord to see poor men with such good appetites. "They eat as if their pockets were lined with gold," he muttered angrily. "Well, let them eat while they can, for they'll lose their appetites once they see the reckoning." When they finished eating, they rested and then called for the reckoning. It was much more than it should have been, but neither Maddie nor the servant objected. "Like a good fellow," the servant said, "will you please to lend me your half-peck measure?" "Like a good fellow indeed," the landlord muttered to himself. "Who are you to call me a good fellow, I'd like to know?" Nevertheless, he went out and got the measure. "Now, master," the servant said, "give me 3 of your 9 silver kopecks." The servant threw the 3 silver kopecks into the measure, shook the measure 3 times, and lo! It was filled to the brim with silver kopecks. The servant counted out the amount of the reckoning and handed the rest of the money to his master. Then he and Maddie went on their way, leaving the landlord gaping after them with open mouth. Day after day, the servant paid the reckoning in the same way at the various inns where they stopped, until they reached, at last, Maddie's native village and the old house that still belonged to him. They settled themselves there, and one day the servant said to Maddie, "Now, master, you know your fate. For having left your native village, you know you are destined to marry a horned woman. You might as well do it at once, for you'll have to do it sooner or later." "That is true," Maddie said. "And if I know the whereabouts of the horned woman who is my fate, I should marry her at once." "In that case, we'll lose no more time," the servant said. "The king has 3 daughters, all of whom are horned. This isn't generally known, but it is true. Let us go to the palace and present your suit. The king will give friendly ear, for there are not many suitors for daughters with horns. He will try to make you take the oldest, who has big horns and a hoarse voice. When she sees you, she'll whisper, 'Take me, take me.' But do you shake your head and answer, 'No, not this one.' Then the king will send for his second daughter. Her horns are not so big, nor is her voice so hoarse. She too will whisper, 'Take me, take me.' But do you again shake your head and answer, 'No, not this one.' Be firm, and the king will finally have to send for his youngest daughter. Her horns are just soft little baby horns, and her voice is just a little husky. Take her, and soon all will be well." So Maddie and the servant went to the palace and got audience with the king. "My master, Maddie," the servant said, addressing the king, "is desirous of marrying a wife with horns." The king was interested at once. "As it happens, I have a daughter with horns," he said. "I'll have her come in." He sent for his oldest daughter, and presently she appeared. Her horns were long and thick. "Take me, take me," she whispered hoarsely as she passed Maddie. "See what a fine girl she is," the king said, "and what well-grown horns she has." But Maddie shook his head. "No, your majesty, I don't think I want to marry this one." "Of course you must follow the dictates of your heart," the king said dryly. "However, come to think of it, my second daughter also has horns. Maybe you'd like to consider her." So the second daughter was called in. Her horns were not so large as her sister's, nor was her voice so hoarse. But Maddie, remembering the servant's warning, refused her too. The king seemed surprised and even annoyed that Maddie should refuse his daughter so glibly, but when he found that Maddie was firm, he said, "I have got another daughter, my youngest, but if it's horns you're looking for, I don't believe you'll be interested in her at all, since her horns are so small and soft that they're hardly noticeable at all. However, as you're here, you might as well see her." So the youngest princess was sent for, and at once Maddie knew that she was the one he wanted to marry. She wasn't as beautiful as a princess should be, but she was gentle and modest, and when she passed Maddie, her cheeks flushed, and she wasn't able to whisper anything. But Maddie felt very sure that if she had whispered, her voice would have been scarcely husky. "This, O king," he said, "is my choice. Let me marry your youngest daughter, and I promise to be a faithful husband to her." The king would have preferred to marry off the older princesses first, for their horns were getting to be very troublesome, but as they all had horns, he was afraid to refuse Maddie's offer. So after a little talk, he gave Maddie the youngest, and in a short time they were married. After the wedding feast, the king led the young couple to the bridal chamber and closed the door. Maddie's servant, meantime, had gone out to the woods to cut some stout switches of birch. When the palace was quiet and all were asleep, he crept softly into the bridal chamber and, dragging the bride out of bed, he beat her unmercifully. "Ow! Oh!" she cried in pain. Her screams woke Maddie, and in fright he jumped out of bed and tried to stop the servant. "Wait!" the servant said. "She is under an evil enchantment, and I am delivering her." So he kept on beating her until he had drawn blood. Then instantly the horns fell from her head, and there she stood, a beautiful young girl released from the evil enchantment that had disfigured her. The servant handed her over to her husband, who fell in love with her on sight and has loved her ever since. "Now, farewell, Maddie," the servant said. "My work is done, and you will need me no longer. You have married a beautiful princess, and the king will soon make you his heir." With these words, the servant disappeared, and Maddie was left alone with his lovely bride. And that was Maddie's reward for having respected the dead. God himself, in the form of the servant, had come down and taken care of him. End of The Mysterious Servant, the story of a young man who respected the dead, by Parker Fillmore.
Stories of Attica, Theseus, by Jesse M. Tatlock. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories of Attica, Theseus. As Heracles was the great hero of the Peloponnesus, who freed all the country around from danger, so Theseus was the hero of Attica, who cleared the roads of giants and robbers and gave liberty and unity to the city of Athens. There was a question about his birth. Some said that his father was Poseidon, and alleged as a proof of this that once when King Minos, to try the hero's divine birth, threw a ring into the sea, Theseus, diving in after it, returned with the ring and a golden crown given him by Amphitrite. It was more generally supposed, however, that his father was Aegeus, the king of Athens, and his mother Aethra, daughter of the king of Troezen. Before his son was born, Aegeus left Aethra at Troezen after placing his sword and sandals under a great rock, with the instructions that the boy, so soon as he was strong enough to lift the stone and get them from under it, should be sent to Athens. Theseus grew up clever and courageous, and tall and strong as well, so that at 16 he easily lifted the stone and joyfully set out for Athens. His mother and grandfather urged him to go by sea, for it was a short and comparatively safe voyage, but wishing to emulate Heracles, he preferred the perilous journey by land. On his way he met with 6 great adventures. First he came upon the giant Periphates, a son of Hephaestus, who brained all travelers with his iron club. Theseus overcame him and took his club. Next he met Sinus, who compelled every passer-by to help him bend down a tall pine tree, and then, fastening the unfortunate by the head to the top of the tree, let it go suddenly. This fate Theseus inflicted on the giant himself. He killed a great sow that ravaged the country. Some say this sow was really a woman whose foul manners earned her this name. His fourth adventure was with Sciron, a giant who kept watch on a narrow pass, where the cliff falls abruptly into the sea. This giant forced all travelers to wash his feet, and when they knelt down to do so, he gave them a kick that sent them into the waters below, where an enormous turtle swallowed them. Theseus gave the turtle a final feast on the giant himself. The next giant he met he overthrew in a wrestling match. Last of all, he overcame Procrustes, who pressed upon strangers the hospitality of his iron bed. But if they were too long, he cut them off, and if they were too short, he stretched them out to fit the bed. When he had reached Athens and had purified himself in the river of all this slaughter, he entered the city. His long hair and his foreign appearance exciting the laughter of some builders, he took a cart that contained huge building blocks and tossed it lightly over the roof of a house. At the palace, although he did not disclose his identity, his father's new wife, the sorceress Medea, recognized him and plotted his death. She persuaded Aegeus to invite him to a feast and offer him a cup of poisoned wine. As they feasted, however, Theseus drew his sword to cut a piece of meat, and his father, instantly recognizing the weapon, dashed the poisoned cup to the floor and sprang to embrace his son. In a rage of disappointed hate, Medea called her dragon-drawn chariot and flew away. Aegeus now proclaimed Theseus as his heir. But the hero, thirsting for glory and adventure, first went to Marathon, where he captured the bull that Heracles had brought from Crete. And then, when the time came around for 7 young men and 7 maidens to be sent as a tribute from Athens to King Minos of Crete, he offered himself as one of their number, hoping to win their return. The tribute had come about in this way. King Minos' son had been killed by the Athenians, and Minos had besieged the city. The Athenians might have stood out against him and his army, but the gods sent a famine and pestilence upon them, and the oracle declared that the divine displeasure would not be appeased until they should accept whatever terms Minos offered. He demanded that every year 7 boys and 7 girls should be sent to Crete to be given to the Minotaur. When the ship bearing Theseus and the 13 other victims started out, it was equipped with a black sail. But Theseus promised his father that should he succeed in his adventure and kill the Minotaur, on the return voyage he would change the black sail for a white one. On their arrival in Crete, King Minos' daughter, Ariadne, fell in love with the hero at first sight, and secretly gave him a ball of string to enable him to thread the mazes of the labyrinth, and a sword to kill the Minotaur. Having succeeded by this means in his difficult adventure, Theseus set sail for home, carrying with him on his ship his benefactress Ariadne. On the island of Naxos, however, he deserted his bride while she slept. Some say because he loved someone else and wanted to get rid of her. Others because he was warned to leave her there, to become the wife of Dionysus. Perhaps it was in requital of his faithlessness to Ariadne that the gods made him forget his promise to raise a white sail if he returned successful. For Aegeus, having watched long from a high rock for the returning ship, thinking when he saw the black sail that his son was dead, threw himself from the rock and was killed. Theseus was recognized as king, and immediately set about instituting reforms. He gave up his absolute royal power, and after uniting in one state all the divisions of Attica, he made of it a free self-governing commonwealth. After this, he started out again on a career of adventure. Like Heracles, he went to the Amazons' country, and from there carried off their queen, Antiope. To recover her, the Amazons besieged Athens, though Antiope herself had fallen so in love with Theseus that she fought by his side against her own people. The Amazons were driven off, but the queen was killed. Pirithous, king of the Lapiths, having heard the fame of Theseus and wishing to make trial of him, drove off some of his cattle. Theseus pursued him, but when they had come near to one another, each was so filled with admiration of the other's noble bearing and courage that by mutual consent they gave up all thought of fighting and swore an oath of friendship. Soon after this, Pirithous celebrated his wedding and invited Theseus to attend. The centaurs, who were also guests, becoming inflamed with wine, attempted to steal the bride. In the battle that followed, Theseus fought bravely by the side of his friend Pirithous, and the centaurs were driven off. The two friends were now fired by the ambition each to have a divine wife. Theseus therefore carried off Helen, the beautiful daughter of Zeus and Leda. As she was not yet of marriageable age, he left her under the care of his mother, and before he returned to claim her, her two brothers, Castor and Polydeuces, rescued her and took her back to Sparta. Pirithous' attempt was yet more daring, for he induced Theseus to help him carry off Pluto's wife, Persephone. Not even Theseus was strong enough for this adventure, and the two heroes were caught and chained in the lower world. Theseus's adventures might have ended here, had not the mighty Heracles, in his quest for Cerberus, found and freed him. On his return to Athens, he found that his people had turned against him and accepted another as king. He therefore retired to the island of Skyros, and there met his death by being thrown from a cliff. The Athenians said that at the Battle of Marathon, a glorious hero, whom they recognized as Theseus, appeared amongst them in full armor and led them on to victory. And after the war, the oracle commanded that Theseus's bones should be brought from Skyros and given honorable burial at Athens. The Athenian leader, Cimon, carried out this command, and having brought the hero's remains home amid great rejoicings, interred them in the middle of the city, and erected a temple in his honor. The wonderfully preserved temple in Athens, called the Theseum, is unfortunately probably misnamed, and the true shrine of Theseus has disappeared. End of the Stories of Attica. Theseus by Jesse M. Tatlock. Recorded by Phil Schempf.